Please like, share, and subscribe. Wishing you happiness and good luck every day.
Welcome to The Explainer. We're about to crack open the secrets to great management. And here's a spoiler. The best advice? It's not new. It's actually timeless. So yeah, today we're diving into this book, Management from the Masters by Morgen Witzel. And its core argument is just fascinating. It says, forget all the new age fads. The real secrets to good management have been around forever. All right, let's start with something I bet a lot of you can relate to. That feeling of pressure, what the book calls the modern manager's dilemma. You know that feeling? Being totally overwhelmed by just how complex work has gotten, buried in emails, constant meetings, nonstop change? If that's you, trust me, you are not alone. And here's the thing, it's not just in your head. The book makes it super clear that, yeah, the job of a manager is getting harder, and there are some really powerful forces driving that. Just look at this list. I mean, it's a total assault, right? We're getting hit from every direction. There's the constant information overload from new tech. Global competition is just off the charts. Then you've got all these new pressures around sustainability and regulations. And of course, customers and society want different things than they used to. It's no wonder it feels like you're trying to manage pure chaos. Okay, so it's chaos. But what if it's not? What if, hidden inside all that noise, there's actually a kind of order? What if the really great leaders aren't just better at reacting, but they're seeing a pattern that the rest of us are missing? And that is the core idea of this whole book. Success, true success, isn't about chasing the latest fad. It's about understanding these unchangeable laws that have always been running the show. Now, we're not talking about little tips or hacks here. These are what the book calls the natural laws of management. And honestly, the best way to think about them is like gravity. They are fundamental forces pulling on every single organization. You can try to ignore gravity, but you can't defy it for long, right? Same deal here. And this quote from Witzel just nails the big danger. It's that arrogance, the feeling that because we work in these big, complex companies, we're somehow special. Like the normal rules of the universe just don't apply to us. Well, spoiler alert, they do. Okay, so let's get into the first of these big laws. And this one is a doozy. It comes straight out of the world of physics. It's called entropy, and it's basically the second law of thermodynamics, but for your business. And what it means is that everything, and I mean everything, your products, your strategies, your reputation, is naturally falling apart all the time. There's no such thing as just staying still. That's the brutal truth. If you're not actively building and creating, then by default, you're decaying. People sometimes call this time's arrow, and this old quote just says it all, doesn't it? The finger writes and it moves on. You can't go back and erase it. That process of decay, of time moving forward, it's totally irreversible. And wow, is history just a graveyard of companies that forgot this rule? I mean, think about the giants. General Motors, just completely stuck on their big SUVs while the world changed. Motorola, hanging on to analog phones. And of course, Kodak. They literally saw the digital revolution coming, but failed to adapt. They all got complacent. They forgot that decay is always working against you. Okay, so that's a bit grim, right? Everything is constantly falling apart. So what's the antidote? What's the force that pushes back? What makes people build and create and fight against that natural decay? Well, to fight back against that decay, you have to tap into the most fundamental engine of human behavior there is, and that's need. It all comes down to what people really want. And you've probably heard of this, but the psychologist Abraham Maslow created the perfect map for it, his famous hierarchy of needs. It's a really simple but incredibly powerful idea. We start at the bottom, right? We need food, water, shelter. Once you've got that covered, you start worrying about safety. Then you want to belong, to connect with people. After that, it's about feeling respected and accomplished. And at the very top, it's about reaching your absolute full potential. And this is not just some dusty old psychology theory. It's an incredibly practical tool for any manager. The masters, they get this. They understand where their people are on this pyramid. And not just their employees, their customers too. Are you selling security? Are you selling a sense of belonging? Or are you selling a path to self-esteem? It changes everything. So let's recap. We've got this force of decay, entropy, constantly pulling everything down. And then we have this powerful engine of human need, pushing everything up. So the big question for a leader is, how do you manage that? How do you navigate between those two giant opposing forces? Well, if you ask Andrew Grove, the legendary CEO of Intel, the answer is simple. 3 words. Only the paranoid survive. See, Grove's whole thing was that you can't just make a 5-year plan and call it a day. He knew that massive, game-changing disruptions were going to happen. He called them strategic inflection points. And these are moments where everything changes. They're the moments that can either make your company or break it. And this chart just lays it out perfectly, doesn't it? The complacent company just kind of waits for disaster, it's coasting on yesterday's success, it ignores the warning signs. But the paranoid company, it's always looking over its shoulder. It's constantly scanning for threats, and, crucially, it challenges its own assumptions. The big takeaway here is that survival isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being the most adaptable. And it's that healthy paranoia that keeps you adaptable. All right, let's tie all 3 of these big ideas together. How does this all form a single mindset? It really comes down to these 3 core forces. First, you have to accept that entropy, that decay, is the default state of everything. It's always there. Second, you have to understand human needs, because that's the engine that creates action and pushes back against the decay. And third, you need that paranoia, that constant awareness, to help you navigate all the change that's coming. So the master manager, it's like they're in a constant battle, fighting universal decay by channeling human motivation, all with the hyper-awareness of a true survivor. Look, knowing these laws is one thing. The real trick is applying them. So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. Look at your own organization. Which one of these natural laws are you breaking right now?
Have you ever wondered why these massive, seemingly unstoppable companies just fall apart? Or why some decisions feel like you can never, ever take them back? Well, the answer, believe it or not, isn't in some dusty business textbook. It's actually a fundamental law of physics that shapes everything around us. It's called the law of entropy, and its partner in crime, time's arrow. So, let's dive right in.
I mean, it's the kind of question that probably keeps CEOs up at night, right? We've all seen this story play out. You think about companies like Nokia, or General Motors, or Kodak. These were absolute titans of their industries. They seemed untouchable. And then, boom, almost overnight, it feels like they just crumble. So what is this invisible force that's pulling them down?
Okay, so the answer, and this might surprise you, isn't hidden away in some MBA program. It actually comes from physics. Yeah, physics. Specifically, the second law of thermodynamics. Now, I know that sounds super complicated, but stick with me here, because the core idea is actually pretty simple, and it has these huge, profound implications for basically every company on the planet. So the big word we need to get our heads around here is entropy. Okay, let's break it down. In the simplest terms, just think of it as the universe's natural tendency to go from order to chaos. It's this universal drift towards decay and disorder, and I mean every system, from a power station that loses a little bit of electricity over its lines all the way to a star that eventually burns out. Everything is subject to entropy. And this right here is the key. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that this decay, this increase in entropy, it's a constant. It's an unavoidable process. Systems don't just magically get more organized on their own. Nope, they naturally fall apart. Energy spreads out, structures get weaker, and things just decay. Okay, so this relentless march towards disorder gives us a really cool concept. An astronomer named Arthur Eddington called it time's arrow. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Time only moves in one direction, forward. And this has 2 massive consequences for us. 1, decay actually gets faster over time, and 2, you can never, ever go back.
All right, let's make this a little more real. Picture a couple of ice cubes sitting in a warm room. At first, right, they just kind of sit there, maybe drip a little. The melting is slow. But then, as a little pool of water forms around them, the whole process just speeds up like crazy. And those last little chunks of ice, they seem to disappear in the blink of an eye. That, my friends, is accelerating decay in action.
But wait a minute, I know what you're thinking. Can't you just put the water back in the freezer? Right? It seems so obvious. The ice melts, you just freeze it again. Problem solved. It feels like you can just hit the rewind button. But can you? Really?
And this is where we have to be super clear. You're not reversing the process. Not at all. You are starting a completely new one. It takes a fresh input of energy, the electricity for your freezer, to create totally different ice cubes. The originals,
they're gone. Forever. Or, here's another way to think about it. You leave a perfect, juicy peach on the counter for a week. It turns into a brown, mushy mess, right? No amount of technology, no amount of energy is ever going to turn that mess back into the fresh peach it was. The process is irreversible. That is time's arrow.
All right, so we've got melting ice, we've got rotting fruit. What in the world does any of this have to do with management or running a business? Well, as it turns out, everything. This fundamental law of physics has a direct, and I mean direct, parallel in the world of corporate strategy and decision-making.
There's this amazing ancient verse that just nails the idea of time's arrow. It goes, "The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on." Basically, what's done is done. Once you make a decision, it leaves its mark on history. You can't just go back and erase the line. And this leads to a super common mistake we see in business all the time. You've probably heard it in a meeting. Hey, let's just try it. If it doesn't work, we can always reverse the decision. But that is a really dangerous way to think, because you can't unmake a decision, you can only make a new decision to try and fix it. And that costs you new resources, new time, new money, a whole new input of energy.
So if these past decisions are permanent, well, they must have some kind of lasting effect, right? And they do. In the world of business and economics, there's a name for this. It's called path dependence. You can think of it as the business version of entropy. It's how the past literally traps you and locks you into a certain future.
So what exactly is path dependence? Well, at its core, any company today is really just the sum of all the choices it has ever made. And all those choices create a path that becomes incredibly difficult, sometimes almost impossible, to get off of. The classic example? The QWERTY keyboard. The one you're probably using right now. It is absolutely not the most efficient layout for typing. But because of a decision made like 100 years ago, we're all completely locked in. The cost and chaos of trying to change it now would just be massive.
So how does this actually play out in the real world, for real companies? Well, the devastating effects of path dependence and entropy, they're basically written all over the stories of some of the biggest corporate failures in history. Let's take General Motors. Back in the late 90s, they went all in on big gas-guzzling SUVs. It was a huge bet. Fast forward about a decade to 2006. Fuel prices go through the roof, and demand for those SUVs just collapses. But that decision from the 90s, it became a giant anchor weighing them down. They were so locked into that path. I mean, their factories, their supply chains, their entire brand identity was built around it. They just couldn't pivot fast enough. And the end result? Bankruptcy.
And you see this pattern again and again. Think about Motorola. For a while, they were the absolute kings of analog cell phones, but they got stuck. They were so dependent on that one path, so invested in that old technology, that they basically just stood on the sidelines and watched as the digital revolution, led by companies like Nokia, completely passed them by.
But here's the crazy part, the real twist in the story. Even the company that wins can become the next victim, Nokia. They completely dominated the digital phone era, but then they fell into the same trap. They became path-dependent on their own success. They were so busy being the king of feature phones that they missed the massive shift to smartphones. And just like that, their own decay started, accelerating faster and faster, just like those melting ice cubes. And of course, we have to talk about Kodak. This is the tragic one. Here's a company that literally invented the core technology for the digital camera, but they were so attached, so path-dependent on their profitable film business that they just couldn't bring themselves to embrace the future they created. Complacency crept in, entropy took hold, and by the time they finally tried to pivot, the game was already over. Okay, so after all these cautionary tales of decay and epic failure, you kind of have to wonder, is this just inevitable? Is every single company doomed to follow this path into chaos and disorder, or is there any way to actually fight back against this fundamental law of the universe? So let's just ask the question straight up. Can a business actually overcome entropy? Is it possible to defy this natural slide into decay?
And the answer is yes, it is possible. But, and this is a huge but, it takes constant, deliberate, relentless effort. Remember how you need a new input of energy to freeze water? Well, it's the same for a company. You have to be constantly injecting new energy into the system. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about fresh capital, new technology, creative brainpower, and a constant search for new ways of thinking to stop that decay from setting in.
And we've seen companies do it Before Nokia was a phone company, they were in forestry and rubber products. Can you believe that? Or look at Tata in India. They went from being this old-school heavy industry giant to a leader in high-tech and services. These companies managed to break free from their past because they injected massive amounts of new energy and were brave enough to completely rethink their entire path.
But let's end on the most important takeaway of all. This struggle against entropy, it never, ever ends. It's a constant, ongoing battle. You don't just beat it once and you're done. The very second a company gets comfortable, the moment it starts to believe its own hype and becomes complacent, that is the exact moment that decay begins again.
Okay, so you've probably heard it 1,000 times in business meetings, right? It's survival of the fittest out there. But what if I told you that this whole idea, the one we all link to Charles Darwin, not only gets his most crucial point completely wrong, but it might actually be hurting your business? Yeah, let's get into it.
We see this quote everywhere. It's on motivational posters. It's definitely been in a PowerPoint presentation you've seen, and it sounds right, doesn't it? That success comes from being responsive. But here's the thing, the very foundation of that quote is a little shaky. Because, and here's the twist, this really popular version, it isn't quite what Darwin said.
And here is the real rule. This is what Darwin actually emphasized. It's not the strongest or the smartest, but those best capable of adaptation. Do you see that subtle shift in language? It's not about just reacting to change when it hits you. It's about having the built-in capability to adapt in the first place. That small change in wording? Well, it's a total game changer for how we should be thinking about success.
So how on earth did this vital idea get so twisted into this simple, aggressive survival of the fittest free-for-all? Let's unpack how Darwin's real rule got so misunderstood.
Well, the main culprit is a theory called social Darwinism. It was championed by people like Herbert Spencer. Now, what they did was take Darwin's ideas and just apply them, pretty ruthlessly, to society and business. This is what created that dog-eat-dog, zero-sum mindset that the strongest companies will win and the weak ones will, and maybe even should, fail. So it's super important to remember, this cutthroat version of evolution wasn't Darwin's main message at all.
Because, nature, and by extension, the business world, is so much more complex than a simple battlefield. In fact, Darwin's theory shows that survival is about way more than just raw competition.
And this slide really shows the other side of the coin. Darwin also wrote about ideas like mutual aid, where different species actually help each other out to survive. He talked about sympathy, or this fellow feeling, where groups protect their weaker members instead of just leaving them behind. And of course, cooperation. Think of a pack of lions hunting together. It turns out it's not just every animal for itself out there. The Russian philosopher Prince Peter Kropotkin took this idea even further. He argued that the great advances of civilization have come about through human beings collaborating in a common cause, rather than competing. I mean, just think about the massive projects we've achieved through collaboration. Even the tech in our phones is built on this very principle.
So if it's not just about outmuscling your rivals, what's the single biggest thing that drives evolution? Well, that's where Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin, comes into the picture. He argued that the answer is pretty simple: the environment. When the environment changes, whether we're talking about the climate or the market, well, species and organizations have to change too. If you fail to adapt, you risk becoming a fossil.
Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating way of looking at the companies we work for. Let's start thinking about organizations as if they are living, breathing things.
And the parallels are, well, they're pretty striking. In nature, organisms compete for resources. In business, we compete for market share. Species cooperate. Businesses form partnerships. And just like life has to adapt to environmental pressures, organizations absolutely have to adapt to market changes. The laws of nature really are the laws of business.
The economist Kenneth Bolden created this amazing framework for this idea. He showed how organizations evolve in complexity, a lot like life itself. They start off as just static structures. Then they become like clockwork machines. But then they start developing feedback systems, self-maintaining cells, and eventually they act like complex living organisms that are aware of and can respond to their surroundings.
But Bolden added one last, absolutely crucial level: the human level. And that, right there, is our superpower. We don't have to just sit around and wait for evolution to happen to us.
We have the self-awareness to know we need to adapt, and we can be intentional about making it happen.
Okay, so knowing we need to adapt is one thing. But how do companies actually behave when change comes knocking? Well, a London Business School professor named Michael Jarrett gives us this brilliant, simple framework. He says there are basically 3 types of companies.
First up, you have the avoiders, and we've all seen these guys. They're the ones sticking their heads in the sand, insisting, oh, this is just a fad, while a giant iceberg is heading straight for them. Then you have the analysts. They see the iceberg, all right, and they immediately form a committee to analyze the iceberg's composition, its speed, its trajectory, right up until it's too late. They get stuck in analysis paralysis. And then finally, you have the goal, the adapters. They see change coming, and they're already turning the ship, getting ready to navigate the new waters.
So, the billion-dollar question, of course, is how do you make sure your company is an adapter? Let's look at a real-world example and then a really clear roadmap for how to do it. Okay, let's take the Tata Group in India. By the late 1980s, it was this beloved but honestly stagnant company that was slowly losing its edge. It was getting disorganized and inefficient. But in 1991, a new leader, Ratan Tata, took over with a very clear vision: adapt to the new globalized economy or perish. And over the next 2 decades, he led a massive, massive transformation.
And the result? It was incredible. They went from total stagnation to becoming a modern multinational powerhouse. Today, they're ranked as one of the most innovative businesses in the entire world. I mean, it is a textbook case of adaptation in action.
So what was the secret sauce? What did Ratan Tata do right? Well, he perfectly demonstrated the 3 essential factors that Michael Jarrett identified. He had the awareness to see the changing global environment. He built the internal capacity for his company to actually handle change, and he provided the decisive leadership to see it all through.
So what does that internal capacity actually look like in practice? Well, here are 5 key skills. First, scanning the horizon. That means you're actively looking for trends, not waiting for them to smack you in the face. Second, making sense of the signs. It's not enough to just see the data, you have to figure out what it means for you. Third, building an open culture where anyone feels safe to raise a red flag. Fourth, removing dysfunctional routines, getting rid of those old habits that hold you back. And finally, fluid execution, the ability to actually make change happen quickly and effectively.
And here is the final, and maybe the most powerful takeaway. Becoming an adapter, it doesn't just happen by accident. The ability to adapt is not a natural state for a big organization. It has to be built into the culture, into the processes, as a matter of deliberate policy. It takes conscious, consistent effort.
Which brings us right back to the central question. As Darwin really pointed out, survival depends on the capability to adapt. In the world of business, it's completely up to us to build that capability. So, take a hard, honest look at your team, your department, your entire company, and ask yourself, avoider, analyst, or adapter, which one are you?
You know, in business, we're always on the lookout for the next big thing, right? The next silver bullet to solve all our problems. But what if the answer isn't some new tool at all, but a really, really old idea? Today, we're going to dig into how the ancient concept of yin-yang can actually be an incredibly powerful mental model for getting through the chaos of the modern business world. Okay, so first things first, we have to get clear on what yin-yang actually means, because there's a huge misconception, especially in the West, that we need to clear up right off the bat. When you see this symbol, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Good versus evil, light versus dark, this epic battle between 2 opposing forces. That's how most of us think about it, 2 separate competing things. But it turns out that's not quite right. The real key is in the translation. It's not yin and yang, it's yin-yang. The literal translation is light-dark. That tiny little hyphen, it changes everything. It tells us these aren't 2 separate things fighting each other, but 2 parts of one single unified whole. And this idea of unity, well, that's the whole ballgame. It's not about a fight, it's about how things depend on each other to create harmony. Let's dive into the philosophy for a second. So this whole concept comes from the ancient Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, and it describes yin-yang not as these clashing forces, but as the fundamental energies, the vital breaths that literally bind the universe together. The text says that all things find their harmony from this constant interplay. Just think about the world around you. I mean, every single day we see the most perfect example of this. Light gives way to dark, and then that darkness gives way to light all over again. It's this seamless, never-ending cycle. You can't have one without the other because they literally define each other. They're just two faces of the exact same 24-hour reality. And once you start looking for this pattern, you see it everywhere in nature. Winter and summer are just parts of the same year. Male and female are essential for life. You can't have the crest of a wave without the trough. Growth and decay, they're just two sides of the very same coin. So, once we really get this idea of unity, we can build a bridge to a concept that trips us up all the time in business and in life, the paradox. Let's start with a classic one. How can the world be light and dark at the exact same time? I mean, from where you're standing right now, it's either day or night. It seems totally impossible for it to be both. But what happens when you change your perspective? Just zoom out. If you've ever been on a long flight and looked at the map on the screen, you've seen it. One side of the planet is always in sunlight and the other is always in darkness. The world is always both. The paradox just disappears. And that right there is the big secret. What we see as a contradiction, a paradox that can't be solved, is often just a failure of our perception. We're just standing too close to see the whole picture. Okay, so let's take this yin-yang lens and use it to look at some of the biggest, most frustrating paradoxes we face in business. All right, let's talk about efficiency versus effectiveness. A hotel that's booked 100% full every single night is perfectly efficient, right? But is it effective? Not really, because it has to turn away valuable last-minute customers. The real insight here is that the most effective hotels actually run at about 93 to 95% capacity. They intentionally build in a little inefficiency to achieve the bigger, more important goal of customer loyalty. Here's another classic dilemma. Should we focus on maximizing profit today, or should we invest in growth for tomorrow? It feels like you have to pick one. Profit is about securing what you have now. Growth is about risking that security for a bigger future. But the real skill is managing this paradox, creating a portfolio of projects where some secure today and others are smart bets on tomorrow. It's not an either-or choice, it's a both-and balancing act. And get this, it is incredibly hard to do. One study found that fewer than 5% of large companies manage to sustain both high profit and high growth for more than 10 years. That just goes to show you how difficult this tension is to manage. Most companies just get stuck on one side. What about regulation and competition? I mean, these are almost always framed as total opposites, but the yin-yang view sees them as completely interdependent. The mental shift is to see how the yin of smart regulation can create a stable, fair marketplace where the yang of real, healthy competition can actually flourish. The brilliant business philosopher Charles Handy put it perfectly. He said that paradoxes aren't just little puzzles we solve now and then. They're a core feature of modern life, and they just become more and more common as the world gets more complex. And man, he saw them everywhere. The paradox of intelligence, where companies can't truly own the brains of their employees. The paradox of productivity, where fewer people create more wealth. The paradox of organizations that have to be both global and local at the same time. They are literally all around us. So, if these paradoxes are everywhere and they're not going away, what are we supposed to do? How do we actually move forward? And this brings us to the final and honestly the most important takeaway. We really only have two choices. We can take the first path. We can fight the paradox. We can try to solve it by insisting that one side is right. Profit is better than growth, efficiency is better than effectiveness. Or we can take the second path. We can accept it. We can stop trying to solve it and instead learn how to manage the tension between the two poles. Because trying to fight it, well, as Charles Handy said, it's a losing battle. A paradox is not a problem waiting for a solution. It's a permanent condition. It is, in his words, inevitable, endemic, and perpetual. And this brings us right back to where we started this whole conversation. The ancient Taoist advice is incredibly practical. First, you just have to recognize that the world is and always will be full of these tensions. And then you stop wasting all that energy trying to make them go away. Instead, you use that understanding to your advantage. So, I'll leave you with this question. Take a look at your own work, maybe even your own life. Which contradiction have you been trying so hard to solve? And what would change if, instead, you just started trying to manage it?
All right, let's talk about a hidden force that's constantly at play in our world, whether we notice it or not. The law of unintended consequences. It's this wild idea that explains how even our best, most thought-out plans can go completely, and sometimes spectacularly, off the rails. You know that feeling, right? You've got this great idea, a solid plan, and you're thinking, this is going to be perfect. But then the result is, well, it's just not what you expected at all. That moment when your brilliant solution somehow ends up creating an even bigger mess? Yeah, there's a name for that.
At its core, it's pretty simple. Our actions can set off a chain reaction that leads to outcomes we never ever planned for. It's like you aim for target A, but the arrow ricochets and hits target B. Or maybe target A and B crash into each other and create a totally new target C that you never even saw coming. It's just a fundamental rule of how complex things work.
To really get this, you have to start thinking of every decision as having a kind of secret life of its own. And this isn't some new age concept. Thinkers throughout history have been wrestling with this very same puzzle for centuries. I mean, seriously, this idea is old. Way back in 1692, you had the philosopher John Locke warning that a plan to cap interest rates to help people would probably backfire and make it harder for them to get loans in the first place. Then you get Adam Smith talking about the invisible hand, which is a positive unintended consequence, right? Where everyone acting in their own self-interest can accidentally help out society as a whole. And by 1850, the economist Frederick Bastiat was basically begging people to look for the unseen effects of every single choice.
So, the big question is, why? Why does this keep happening? Why do our best intentions so often go sideways? Well, lucky for us, there's a really useful framework that helps break it all down.
And we have the sociologist Robert K. Merton to thank for it. He really dug into this whole concept, applying it to how societies and companies work, and he boiled it down to 5 main culprits.
So here are Merton's 5 traps. First up is just plain ignorance. We don't know what we don't know. Second is error. We have the facts, but we totally misread them. Third, and this one is a big one, is immediacy of interest. This is when we go for a quick win for ourselves and just ignore the long-term pain it's going to cause someone else. Fourth is basic values, where we stick to a rigid belief so hard that we follow it off a cliff, even when all the evidence says it's a bad idea. And finally, you've got the really ironic one, self-defeating prophecies, where the very thing you do to stop a problem is what ends up creating it.
Merton's own example for immediacy of interest is, well, it's pretty chilling. He talks about a company that dumps toxic waste to save money. That's the immediate, intended benefit for them. The unseen, or in this case, the willfully ignored consequence, is the terrible health problems for everyone living downstream. It's a deliberate trade-off where one group's short-term gain becomes another's long-term disaster.
But here's the twist. Unintended consequences are not always a bad thing. Sometimes our mistakes can lead to something amazing. I mean, look at aspirin. It was made to be a painkiller. Simple as that. But then, whoops, it turns out it's fantastic at helping prevent heart attacks. Or how about Cow Chemical, who had this useless byproduct lying around that turned out to be the perfect ingredient for floppy disks, making them a global powerhouse. But on the flip side, you get spectacular backfires, like prohibition in the US. The goal was to reduce crime and make people healthier. But instead, it created the perfect conditions for organized crime to absolutely explode. Now let's look at a real-world business story that shows just how high the stakes can be. This is the story of how a single, well-intentioned decision sent one of America's most loved companies into an absolute tailspin. Okay, so you have to picture this. It's the mid-90s, and Delta Airlines is the gold standard. Customers adore them. Their employees are famous for providing incredible service. That loyalty, that happy culture, that was their secret weapon.
Then a new leadership team comes in, and they're worried about the future, so they make a big move. They launch this huge, aggressive, company-wide cost-cutting plan. The intended consequence? To make the airline leaner, tougher, and more financially stable. A totally logical goal, right?
But that unseen chain reaction was just brutal. I mean, this was a textbook case of Merton's ideas in action. You had immediacy of interest, with leaders slashing costs for short-term financial wins, and maybe some ignorance or error where they totally underestimated the value of their own employees. The cuts hit wages hard and morale just evaporated, and that legendary customer service, it completely nosedived. Loyal customers started leaving in droves, and by 2005, the unthinkable happened. Delta filed for bankruptcy.
The damage was just incredible. It took a full decade, 10 lost years, for the company to even begin to claw its way back. All from that one decision where the unintended consequences were completely and utterly overlooked.
So what's the big takeaway here? How do we avoid becoming the next Delta?
How do we maybe even learn to use this law to our advantage? Well, it all comes down to changing the way we think about our choices.
And that brings us right back to what Frederick Bastiat was saying all those years ago. The lesson is simple, but it's not easy. We have to force ourselves to look past the immediate result, the thing we want to happen, and ask that all-important question. Okay, and then what?
So I'll just leave you with that thought. The next time you're about to make a choice, big or small, just pause for a second. Think about the ripples. What could be the secret life of your next decision?
Welcome. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most powerful ideas in all of psychology. It's a framework that tries to answer a huge question. What is it that really, truly drives us? And that big question is this: why on earth do we do the things we do? You know, from the simple act of getting out of bed in the morning to the giant life choices we make. What's the engine behind all of our actions? Well, according to a major school of thought in psychology, it all boils down to one single powerful word: need. That's it. Every single thing we do is ultimately driven by some kind of need that we're trying to fulfill. So yeah, this idea of need being the central driving force is absolutely key to understanding human motivation. It's a concept that has massive implications for, well, pretty much everything, from how we behave at work to what we decide to buy. And the guy who famously took all these human needs and organized them into one elegant framework was the American psychologist Abraham Maslow. His hierarchy of needs became this incredible model for understanding what makes us tick. So let's do it. Let's actually climb this hierarchy. We're going to build Maslow's famous pyramid from the ground up, starting with the stuff that drives us most fundamentally. All right, so the pyramid's foundation, the very bottom layer, is our physiological needs. Think air, food, water, sleep, the absolute basics for survival. Once we've got those covered, we start looking for safety, both in our bodies and our finances. Next up the ladder, we crave connection, that sense of belongingness and love. After that comes our need for self-esteem, feeling good about ourselves and getting respect. And then, right at the very top, the peak of the mountain, is self-actualization, that drive to become the best version of ourselves we can possibly be. Now, the whole pyramid works because of one crucial rule, the prepotency principle. Fancy name, simple idea. It just means the needs at the bottom have to be taken care of first. Think about it. A starving artist isn't worried about their creative legacy. Their entire world shrinks down to finding your next meal. Survival always wins. But, Maslow was smart. He knew this wasn't some perfectly rigid structure. Life happens, right? A major event like losing a job can knock you right back down to the safety level. And not everyone even starts at the bottom. A kid growing up in a safe, loving home might start their journey much higher up. And that peak self-actualization, it's not really a finish line you cross. It's more of a constant journey of becoming. Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this pyramid actually show up in the real world? Let's start by looking at it in a business context and explore motivation at work. Let's be real. At the most basic level, a job is about survival. Your paycheck covers those bottom two layers of the pyramid. It puts food on the table and a roof over your head. That's the fundamental deal when it comes to work. But once you're not constantly worried about paying the bills, your motivation starts to shift. That need for belongingness really kicks in. Suddenly, the friendships at work, the teamwork, that feeling of being part of a tribe, that can become way more important than just the paycheck. This quote from an executive at the Indian watchmaker Titan just nails this idea. He's saying that even when people were frustrated with their bosses, that powerful feeling of being Titanians, that sense of belonging, was so strong that it kept them loyal to the company itself. Now, climbing to that next level, self-esteem, takes us on a little trip back in time to the famous Hawthorne studies in the 1920s. Researchers were totally stumped. They were changing things in a factory, the lighting, the hours, and no matter what they did, productivity went up. The amazing conclusion? The workers weren't responding to better lighting. They were responding to being noticed. Just the simple act of feeling seen and valued boosted their self-esteem, and that, in turn, made them better workers. And that brings us to the very top, self-actualization. This is where a job stops being a job and starts being a calling. These are the people who are driven by something internal, the innovators, the dreamers, the ones who push the boundaries just for the love of the work itself. For any company that wants to change the world, tapping into that drive is the ultimate prize. So, the hierarchy lines up perfectly with motivation at work. But what's super fascinating is that it's just as powerful for explaining why we buy the things we do. Let's switch gears and see how these needs drive us as consumers. Check this out. A consultant named Rama Bijaporkar actually used this hierarchy to map out the Indian consumer market. At the very bottom, you have the resigned, who are just buying things to survive. A bit higher up, the strivers might buy their first scooter, a tool to build a better life. Then you have the mainstreamers, who buy brands that signal they belong. And at the top, the aspirers and the successful buy luxury goods, not because they need them, but to show off status and power. See? Every group is buying based on a different level of the pyramid. Now, as amazing as this model is, it's not perfect. No theory is. So let's take a quick look at some of the cracks that have shown up in Maslow's pyramid over the years. The biggest complaint is probably that it's just a little too rigid, a little too neat. In real life, we're all operating on multiple levels at the same time. I might be writing something, which feels like self-actualization, but an hour from now, I'll be focused on belongingness when I meet up with friends. And what about people who risk their own safety for a cause they believe in? Are they driven by a need for safety or a need for self-actualization? The truth is, it's probably both. But even with its flaws, Maslow's work was a game changer. It inspired other thinkers like Douglas McGregor. He basically translated the pyramid into two styles of management. You have Theory X managers who think people are only motivated by the bottom of the pyramid, money and job security. Then you have Theory Y managers who believe people are actually driven by the top of the pyramid, that they want responsibility, a sense of achievement, and a chance to grow. So after climbing this pyramid, looking at our jobs, our shopping habits, and even questioning the theory itself, what's the big ultimate takeaway here? In the end, it all comes back to that one simple word, need. Employees go to work to satisfy their needs. Customers buy products to satisfy their needs. The entire global economy, from the office to the shopping mall, is really just a huge, complex dance choreographed by this one powerful human drive. And that leaves us with a final and I think really important question. If need is the fundamental force connecting us all, how can we do a better job of designing our companies and our products to not just meet those needs, but to actually help everyone, employees and customers, climb a little bit higher up that pyramid?
Hello and welcome. Ever wonder why some of the biggest names in business seem to implode out of nowhere? Well, today we're going to dig into that. And it all comes down to an unbreakable law that connects ancient philosophy with the absolute fundamentals of modern business. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is the core idea. It's a version of the Golden Rule put into words by the philosopher Confucius more than 2,500 years ago. And yeah, it sounds pretty simple, right? But as we're about to see, what's hiding inside this idea is huge, not just for how we should live, but for the very nature of success and failure in the business world.
So, to really get why this rule is so powerful, we've got to jump back in time. We need to understand the world that Confucius was living in, a world that was on the very edge of collapse, a world he was trying desperately to hold together.
You see, Confucius was living at this real tipping point in history. He could see the stable society he knew just starting to fall apart around him. He knew this total chaos was on the horizon, and he believed the only way to build something that lasts was to base it on one simple, powerful idea: reciprocity. Basically, the idea that whatever you put out there, you get back. It's a system that builds on mutual benefit and, most importantly, trust.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because you see how Confucius's view of human nature was so different. You had Plato, who thought people were just naturally drawn to being good. Then you had Han Fei, who was like, nope, people need strict laws and punishments to keep them in line. But Confucius, he was way more of a realist. He argued that, yeah, people will behave ethically, but usually only if they think they'll get the same treatment back. For him, ethics wasn't just some feeling inside you. It was a predictable system that ran on mutual self-interest.
Okay, so that brings us to a really crucial question. What's the link between doing the right thing and doing the smart thing? As we're about to see, being ethical isn't just about sacrifice. It's actually a killer strategy for long-term success.
And look, this isn't just some dusty old philosophy. We say it all the time. What goes around, comes around. And that's exactly what Confucius got. He knew that people are way more likely to act with integrity if they trust that they'll be treated with integrity in return. That trust creates this amazing positive feedback loop.
So fine, but how does this actually work in the real world? In the cutthroat, high-stakes world of modern business? Well, let's take a look at the story of Ian Ray, a businessman in China who came face-to-face with this exact problem.
And his story's perfect because it shows you the two paths that open up. Ray's whole point was, look, if you pay a bribe, that's path A. Suddenly you get a reputation. You're the guy who pays bribes. And guess what? That just brings more corrupt people knocking on your door. It's a total downward spiral. But if you refuse, yeah, path B is going to hurt in the short term, but you start building a reputation for being honest, and that is like a magnet for other honest people. It creates an upward spiral, a rock-solid foundation of trust, and that becomes your real long-term competitive advantage.
All right, so we've seen the upside of being ethical. But what about the other side of the coin? Do the people who break the rules really get away with it? Let's take a look at what happens when this law gets ignored.
To figure that out, let's dive into some of the biggest, most infamous corporate scandals you've ever heard of. These are the stories of companies that look like they were on the top of the world, right before they crashed and burned.
Let's start with Enron. Remember them? Back in the 90s, everyone thought they were geniuses, this revolutionary energy company changing the world. The only problem? Their amazing success was all fake, a complete mirage built on a tangled web of phony accounting and lies.
And then, of course, there's Bernie Madoff. He promised his investors these incredible steady profits, but he wasn't investing a dime of their money. He was just running a gigantic Ponzi scheme, paying off old investors with cash he got from new ones.
And you can't forget Nick Leeson. This was one guy, a single trader who tried to hide his losses by making bigger and crazier secret bets until, boom, he single-handedly brought down Barings Bank, one of Britain's oldest, most respected financial institutions. Just gone.
Now, the crazy thing is, all these scams worked, for a little while anyway. They created massive amounts of wealth on paper and made these guys look like superstars. So, what happened? What was that one thing that made the whole house of cards finally collapse? Well, a lot of the time, the truth comes crawling out of the woodwork when the economy tanks. You know that old saying, when the tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming naked? That's exactly it. Enron, Madoff, their schemes blew up when the easy money dried up. It exposed just how rotten things were on the inside. But see, a bad economy is just the trigger. The rot was already there. And this all points to something much, much deeper. A fundamental law that explains why these collapses weren't just a possibility. They were guaranteed to happen. And to get it, we actually have to borrow an idea from physics.
That law is called entropy. And in simple terms, it's just the natural tendency for any system to fall apart over time, to go from order to chaos, unless you're constantly putting in real energy to hold it together.
And that is the key. When you're running a crooked business, you're not just breaking society's laws. You are literally fighting a fundamental law of the universe. And that is a fight you will never, ever win.
Let me break it down for you. Think of any business as a system, right? When you have real growth, you're making actual products people want. That's like putting energy into the system. It builds order, it makes things stable. But all that shady stuff, the fake accounting, it does the exact opposite. It doesn't create any real value, it just fakes it. And all it's really doing is pumping more disorder, more chaos, more entropy into the system until the whole thing just collapses under its own weight. It's inevitable.
And you've got to remember why these guys did this. It wasn't about survival. They weren't desperate. They were driven by pure ambition and, honestly, a desperate need to feel important and be admired. I mean, Nick Leeson himself said he loved being seen as this superstar trader, even when he knew, deep down, it was all just a giant lie.
So here's what it all boils down to. Confucius wasn't just being philosophical all those years ago. His golden rule is actually a practical handbook for how the universe really works. Being ethical isn't just about taking the moral high ground. It's a strategy. It's about aligning yourself with this fundamental, unbreakable law of entropy. And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about in our own jobs and in our own lives. Are your actions creating genuine, sustainable value? Or are you just adding to the chaos, just increasing the entropy? It's really the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves, isn't it? So what if I told you that a 2,300-year-old rule held the key to solving one of today's biggest, most frustrating management problems? In this explainer, we're about to unearth some ancient wisdom from a master strategist that honestly feels more relevant now than ever before. Okay, so this right here, this is the core idea from an ancient Indian sage named Kautilya. It's a really powerful principle. Real value, real wealth, is generated by constant, purposeful action. He argues that just sitting still, being inactive, well, that's not neutral. It's the evil that leads to decay. We're going to unpack what this really means for anyone trying to build or lead something in the 21st century.
So, before we can even start applying this rule, we've got to understand the mind it came from, right? Who exactly was this ancient master strategist?
So this guy, Kautilya, you might also know him as Chanakya, was a pretty big deal. He was the chief advisor, the right-hand man to the founder of India's great Mauryan Empire. So he wasn't just some philosopher sitting in a room, he was a practitioner. He wrote the Arthashastra, which is a legendary guide to strategy, economics, and statecraft.
Now what's really fascinating is the context here. Kautilya wasn't thinking in a vacuum. I mean, look at this timeline. He was a contemporary of giants like Aristotle, and he was active just as Confucian ideas were spreading across Asia. With Alexander the Great's invasion of India and bustling trade routes, Kautilya was standing right at a global crossroads of ideas.
All right, so let's keep building on this. If Kautilya was thinking about the big picture, what did he see as the ultimate goal for a leader? I mean, what's the real purpose of having power in the first place?
The answer, it all comes down to a single, really powerful word: Dharma. Now, this is a crucial concept. It's not just about a list of rules. It's about maintaining the natural, righteous order of things. For Kautilya, a leader's #1 job is to uphold this Dharma, creating a balanced environment where their organization and, importantly, its people can flourish.
And this is where Kautilya's thinking takes a totally different path from some of his famous contemporaries. You've got thinkers like Plato and Confucius who often aimed for a golden mean, a kind of perfect static harmony that you just try to preserve. But Kautilya saw the world as constantly shifting. For him, order wasn't about preventing change. It was maintained through constant, purposeful activity. It's a dynamic idea, not a static one.
This brings us to a fundamental law of the universe, one that Kautilya, and this is wild, seemed to get intuitively thousands of years before science even gave it a name. You know, he basically realized there's no such thing as standing still. In business, in nature, in your own life, you're either growing or you're decaying. This natural tendency for things to fall into disorder is called entropy, and the only way to fight it, the only way to create growth, is with energy and action. Doing nothing isn't a neutral choice. It's actively choosing decay. Okay, so if the default state of everything is decay, then a leader's purpose becomes crystal clear, right? They have to be the engine of activity. Their whole role is to be the main change agent, making sure the organization stays flexible and is always evolving, while at the same time rooting out things like corruption and inefficiency that just speed up that natural decay.
So what we get is this really powerful formula for creating value. You start with what Confucius said: virtue is the root. That's step 1, the foundation. But Kautilya provides that crucial second step, the engine of activity. So virtue plus purposeful activity, that's what creates growth, which in turn generates real, lasting value.
Okay, so this all sounds great in ancient philosophy, but how does it actually solve a real-world modern problem? Well, let's look at that classic, often tense relationship between management and employees.
The engineer Harrington Emerson pointed this out over a century ago. A company thinks it's buying output, the results of the work, but an employee, they think they're selling their time. They're fundamentally trading in two different currencies. This misunderstanding is the source of so much conflict, with each side feeling like the other just doesn't get it.
And this is where Kautilya's rule just slices right through that paradox. It completely reframes the relationship by shifting the goal. It's not about output versus time anymore. The shared goal is activity. The worker's time and the company's needs aren't opposing forces at all. They are codependent inputs needed to create value. They're two halves of the exact same whole.
And hey, this isn't just some dusty old theory. You can see this principle in action with some incredible modern leaders. Jay and Tata's ethos, what comes from the people, has gone back to the people, recognizes that all value comes from their activity. Or Vineet Nair's radical employees first strategy, which is all about empowering the people who perform the core activities. In both cases, profit isn't the goal. It's seen as a natural byproduct of a healthy, active system.
So let's bring this all home. What is all this ancient wisdom telling us about the true role of a leader, and really the ultimate purpose of a business here in the 21st century?
You know, there's actually a modern term for this exact idea: servant leadership.
It's the philosophy that a leader isn't a master, but a servant to the organization. Their main responsibility is to clear the path and make sure everyone else can be as productive and fulfilled as possible.
And this idea has such deep roots. You see it echoed by Mahatma Gandhi, and it's the absolute essence of Kautilya's rule. A leader's highest duty, their dharma, is to enable other people to be active and to create value. In short, the leader serves the system, not the other way around.
So this brings us to a whole new way of looking at a business, doesn't it? Its purpose isn't just to make money for shareholders. Its deeper purpose, its dharma, is to serve society. And it does that by creating an environment for meaningful activity, allowing people to find purpose and to grow through their work.
And that leaves us with one final question, a question for you to think about. When you look at your own workplace, your team, or even your own career, do you see purposeful activity and growth? Or do you see the quiet, creeping forces of entropy? Kautilya's rule reminds us that the choice between the two is made every single day, through action.
So, what if I told you that one of these single most powerful rules for success isn't about what you know, but about what you have the courage to admit you don't know? Today, we are digging into a really simple but totally profound principle from the one and only Warren Buffett. And trust me, it's a rule that can be the razor's edge between genius and total disaster. And there it is, in all its simplicity. Never invest in something you don't understand. I mean, it sounds like common sense, right? Almost too obvious. But we're about to find out that the real genius is hiding right there, in plain sight.
And yeah, that is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Because, it's one thing to know about something. It's a completely different universe to truly understand it. And that little distinction, that's where fortunes are made and, well, where they're lost.
Okay, to really see this rule in action, let's hop in the time machine and go back to one of the wildest, most frenzied periods in recent memory, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s. Man, the late 90s were just a crazy time. The internet was exploding, right? It felt like if you just slapped a .com on the end of a company name, you were basically printing money. But while everyone, and I mean everyone, was jumping into this frenzy, Buffett just sat on the sidelines. People called him a dinosaur, totally out of touch. But then, when the music stopped in 2001 and the whole thing came crashing down, his discipline didn't just look smart, it looked like genius. And this, right here, just lays it all out. It was a tale of two completely different mindsets. On one side, you had the herd, and they were driven by a feeling we all know, FOMO, the fear of missing out. On the other side, you had Buffett, guided by this calm, rational need for real understanding. He was totally okay with being the odd one out. And that, well, that made all the difference.
So what was actually going on inside Buffett's head during all this chaos? Let's peel back the layers here and get into his actual thought process. It's not what you might think.
And this is absolutely the key thing to get. Buffett wasn't trying to be a fortune teller. He didn't have a crystal ball. He wasn't going around saying, "This is a bubble, it's all gonna end in tears." Nope. His rule is way more personal and way more disciplined than that. This quote just says it all, perfectly. He wasn't making some grand judgment on the entire tech industry. He was making an honest judgment about himself. He was basically saying, look, I can't figure out how these companies are going to make actual, sustainable money down the road, so I'm out. He was staying inside what he calls his circle of competence. So, this gets us to the absolute heart of his philosophy. It's this critical difference between having knowledge and having true understanding. They are not the same thing. Think about it for a second. The dot-com investors, they had tons of knowledge. They knew the stock prices were shooting for the moon. They knew the founders went to Stanford. Those are facts. But what they were missing was understanding. They couldn't answer the most fundamental question: how does this business actually create value and make money long term? Let me give you a really simple analogy to make this stick. Pretty much all of us listening know how to use a computer. We can send emails, we can surf the web, we have the operational knowledge. Right, but how many of us could actually explain how the microprocessor works or what the code is doing behind the screen? That deeper level, that is true understanding. And that's the level of clarity Buffett needs before he's willing to put a single dollar on the line. And hey, if you think the dot-com bubble was a one-off thing, think again. Let's fast forward just a few years, and you see the exact same principle play out in another massive financial meltdown. The 2008 financial crisis. The real villain of that story was these incredibly complicated financial products tied to the housing market. They were built on these math models that were so complex that, honestly, almost nobody, not on Wall Street and definitely not in Main Street, really understood the gigantic risks they were piling up. And just like with the dot-coms, the pressure to just join the party was intense. It felt like you had to be in the game, even if you had no idea what the rules were. It was basically a high-stakes casino where nobody really knew how the games were rigged. And when the dust settled, the results were a brutal reminder of Buffett's rule. The banks that just dove right in, like Lehman Brothers, they got completely wiped out, gone. But the ones who were a little more suspicious, like HSBC and Santander, they survived. The line between total ruin and resilience was that simple. Did they really understand what they were getting into? Now, here's the thing. Don't make the mistake of thinking this is just some rule for stocks and bonds. This principle applies to every single major decision in business, and you could argue in life too. Let's talk about one of the most famous corporate disasters in history, the merger of AOL, the king of the new internet world, and Time Warner, the old media giant. I mean, on paper, it looked brilliant, a bold vision for the future of everything. But they failed catastrophically to understand one crucial thing: the people. The two company cultures were like oil and water. The clash between the scrappy, fast-moving internet guys and the buttoned-up traditional media giant was so bad it led to a loss of $100 billion in 1 year, all because they didn't understand the human element. Or how about this one? Schwinn, the iconic American bicycle brand. They decided to outsource their design and manufacturing to partners in Taiwan. Seemed like a really smart way to cut costs. But here's the kicker. They didn't truly understand their new partners. They didn't understand the culture, and they didn't pay close enough attention to the contracts. And that little lack of understanding, it was fatal. Their partners learned the business inside and out, started their own brands, took over Schwinn's markets, and pushed that legendary American company right to the edge of bankruptcy. So we've seen the history. We've seen the epic failures. What does all this mean for us, right here, right now? How do we actually use this powerful rule in our own lives? Well, when you're staring down something complex that you don't quite get, you really only have 3 choices. Number 1, you can decide to study. Do the hard work, ask the dumb questions, and actually gain true understanding. Number 2, you can have the discipline to just walk away and say, you know what, this isn't for me. Or number 3, you can just close your eyes, proceed anyway, and hope for the best. The first 2 are smart strategies. The last one, it's a recipe for disaster. And really, that's the question I want to leave you with. In your life, in your career, think about it. Whether it's a new job, a new technology, a big investment, or even a relationship, what are the things that are just too important for you to move forward on without genuine understanding? What will you refuse to misunderstand?
You know that feeling you get sometimes? That little nagging voice in the back of your head that says you're missing something? Like a huge change is right around the corner and you are just not ready for it? Well, guess what? You're not alone. In fact, one of the most legendary CEOs ever, Andrew Grove of Intel, basically built his entire philosophy around that exact feeling. Today, we're going to dig into his famous and, pretty provocative rule: only the paranoid survive.
Only the paranoid survive. Wow. I mean, that phrase really hits you, doesn't it? It kind of makes you think of sleepless nights, always looking over your shoulder. It suggests a world where the second you let your guard down, you're done for. And for Grove, that wasn't just a suggestion. It was pretty much a law of the universe, especially in business.
So, hold on. Was Grove actually saying we should all live in a state of constant, crippling fear? Or was he pointing at something a little deeper, a more fundamental truth about change itself? That's the big question we're going to unpack right here.
All right, so here's our game plan. To really get what Grove was talking about, we've got to start with the man himself. His incredible story really shaped his worldview. Then, we'll dive into his big idea, strategic inflection points. We'll look at a wild, real-life corporate showdown that shows what happens when you get it right and when you get it wrong. We'll even give you a toolkit for building your own paranoid mindset. And at the very end, we're going to turn it all around and ask you a question that might just change how you see your own future.
Look, to understand why Andrew Grove was so obsessed with survival, you have to understand where he came from. This wasn't some guy who learned about risk from a textbook. No, he learned about it on the streets of a war-torn country. Just try to imagine this for a second. As a kid, you survive World War II. Then you live under this brutal communist regime. And then, at 20 years old, you escaped your home country with literally nothing. That was Andrew Grove's life. An experience like that teaches you, deep in your bones, that change isn't some slow, predictable thing. It's a tidal wave that can wipe you out in a blink. And that's the lesson he brought with him to Silicon Valley. For him, this wasn't theory, it was personal.
So that survivalist instinct gave Grove this totally unique way of looking at the business world. He didn't see it as some neat, orderly path. He saw it as a series of earthquakes, these sudden, massive shifts that could topple even the biggest giants. And he gave them a name: strategic inflection points.
Think of it like this. The old-school way of thinking about business problems, what military guys like Clausewitz called friction, is kind of like your car slowly running out of gas. You feel it sputtering, it's a gradual, predictable slowdown. But Grove's idea, the strategic inflection point, isn't like that at all. It's like a lightning bolt hits your car and the whole thing just explodes. One is a slow grind, the other is a sudden, game-changing catastrophe.
So what is a strategic inflection point really? It's that one moment when the rulebook gets thrown out the window and everything changes, forever. Think about the invention of digital cameras. For a company like Sony, it was this massive opportunity. But for a company like Kodak, it was the beginning of the end. That right there is a strategic inflection point. The only question is, which side of it are you going to be on?
Okay, so how do you actually survive one of these business earthquakes? Well, to figure that out, we're going to look at a real-life corporate drama that put Grove's entire philosophy to the ultimate test. It's a tale of two companies, two massive crises, and two totally different endings.
It's 1994, and Intel is on top of the world. Their Pentium chip is the brand. It's the gold standard. And then, disaster. A tiny, almost invisible math flaw is discovered in the chip. The problem? It's already inside thousands and thousands of computers all over the globe. For Intel, this was an absolute nightmare. Okay, so after the first shockwave hit, Intel's response was honestly a masterclass. They didn't try to hide it, they didn't make excuses, they went all in. They stood up and promised to replace every single faulty chip out there. No questions asked, for free. It was a huge, decisive move that was going to cost them a fortune. But in the end, it was the move that saved their company.
$500 million. Just let that number sink in. That's what Intel was willing to pay to make things right. It's a staggering amount of money, right? But to Grove, it wasn't a cost. It was an investment. He wasn't just fixing a piece of silicon. He was saving their reputation, rebuilding trust, and sending a message that Intel stood by its products, period. That's what being paranoid looks like in action.
Now let's flip the coin. Let's look at another company that faced a crisis of a similar scale around the same time, but had a completely different reaction. We're talking about the year 2000, when a series of deadly accidents involving Ford SUVs were all traced back to one thing: their Firestone tires.
So instead of facing the crisis head-on like Intel, Firestone did pretty much the exact opposite. They tried to ignore it. They denied there was a problem. And then, when the evidence was just too overwhelming to ignore, their response was slow, clumsy, and just totally weak. They were missing the one thing that could have saved them: a healthy dose of paranoia.
And the result? It was an absolute train wreck. Their partnership with Ford, which had lasted for a century, was completely destroyed. The trust they had built with customers over generations? Gone in just a few months. And the company itself, once a titan of industry, ended up getting swallowed by its rival, Bridgestone. It was just a brutal, brutal lesson in what happens when you get complacent.
So, the big question is, how do you make sure your team, your company, is more like Intel and less like Firestone? How do you build a culture of what Grove called healthy paranoia? Because it's not about making everyone scared, it's about making everyone ready.
A paranoid organization is kind of like a great chess player. It's always thinking a few moves ahead. It actually encourages fierce debate. It challenges every single assumption. It's constantly running what-if scenarios for things that seem totally crazy or unlikely. Because, as Grove knew all too well, the unlikely has a funny way of becoming reality. It's not about predicting the future. It's about having a flexible, well-exercised mind that's ready for whatever comes next.
I love this quote from the strategist Kenichi Omai because it just nails it. When that crisis finally hits, you don't want to be the deer in the headlights, just frozen and terrified. You want to be the one who saw it coming, who's already run through the possibilities, and who's ready to act. That's the real power of paranoia.
And that, of course, brings us to the most important part of this whole thing. what does this mean for you? Because Grove's rule isn't just for big-shot CEOs. It's a mindset. It applies to your career, your team, your projects. The principle is always the same. You either adapt or you perish.
At the end of the day, it really all boils down to a choice between two mindsets. You can be vigilant, adaptable, always questioning things, and you survive. Or you can be rigid, ignore the warning signs, stick to the old plan no matter what, and you perish. One path leads to survival, maybe even success. The other, as we saw with Firestone, leads straight to a dead end.
So, as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. What is the earthquake that's about to shake up your world? What's that fundamental shift in technology, in your market, in your industry, that you're maybe dismissing as just a little tremor? Because according to Andrew Grove, finding the answer to that question isn't just a good idea. It is the absolute key to your survival.
You've probably heard of Moore's Law, right? That relentless ticking clock of technological progress. But what if I told you it's not just an engine for innovation? What if it's also a brilliantly disguised trap just waiting to catch you off guard? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack both sides of this incredibly powerful rule.
So, it all started with this pretty simple observation from Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel. He noticed that the number of transistors you could fit on a chip, which is basically a computer's brainpower, was doubling about every 2 years. Now, this isn't some law of physics. It was just an observation that kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy for the entire tech industry, setting this predictable and unbelievably fast pace for everything that came next. And this, of course, leads us to the big question, the one we all face with our phones, our laptops, and especially in business. If everything gets twice as good every couple of years, are you a fool for not upgrading? I mean, is standing still actually the same thing as falling behind? Let's dive in.
Okay, first, we really have to get our heads around the sheer scale of this change. It's one thing to say doubles every 2 years, but it's a whole other thing to truly grasp what that kind of exponential growth actually looks and feels like.
Here's a powerful way to think about it. Comparing a home computer from the 1980s to a modern laptop, that's like comparing a Stone Age flint axe to a brand new chainsaw. Sure, both of them can technically cut down a tree, but the power, the complexity, and what you can really do with them, well, they're just worlds apart. It's not just a bigger number. It's a completely different kind of tool. Gordon Moore's successor at Intel, the legendary Andrew Grove, he framed it perfectly. This progress feels, well, it feels inevitable. Even if the pace slows down a tiny bit, say things double every 3 years instead of 2, the finish line is absolutely nowhere in sight. The boundaries of what's possible are just constantly being shoved further and further out.
But here's the twist, and this is where it gets really interesting. This unstoppable force of progress creates a hidden challenge, a paradox that can trip up even the smartest people.
So here's the heart of it. The very technology that we buy to make our lives simpler and more efficient is, by its very nature, becoming more and more complex. Think about it. A more powerful and effective tool almost always has more moving parts, more features, more things that all have to work together perfectly.
And this isn't some new idea. Way back in World War II, the physicist Norbert Wiener figured this out while he was designing anti-aircraft systems. He realized that to effectively track multiple enemy planes coming from different directions, the system had to be more flexible, more reactive, which meant, you guessed it, it had to be more complex. That same principle applies to everything today, from our cars to our software.
And this is where the danger starts to creep in. Because whenever you increase the complexity in any system, you also introduce a natural, unavoidable risk. In the world of physics, they have a name for it: entropy.
To put it simply, entropy is the idea that the more pieces you have, the more connections there are, the more opportunities there are for something to break. A simple bicycle has, a few dozen parts? A modern car has thousands. And a single weak link in that car's incredibly complex system, a tiny faulty sensor, a little software bug, can bring the whole highly advanced machine to a grinding halt. That's the hidden cost of progress. So let's see how this plays out in the real world. Because when we ignore this whole paradox of complexity and entropy, we walk straight into an investment trap that has cost companies and even entire countries billions and billions of dollars.
The trap is thinking Moore's Law is some kind of command, like you must upgrade every 2 years. Think about someone who trades in a perfectly good car every 2 years just to get the newest model. They almost never stop to calculate if the tiny improvement in gas mileage actually pays for the massive cost of that new car. It's an emotional decision, not a logical one. And believe me, businesses do this all the time.
This example just illustrates the difference between smart and reactive investing perfectly. Back in the 90s, the UK went all in on fiber optic for landlines. It seemed like a great idea. But then, boom, broadband arrives, and it turns out that specific cabling wasn't ideal, which forced another huge round of investment. Meanwhile, you have countries like China and India who saw what was coming. They waited, they leapfrogged that entire landline generation, and they invested directly into mobile infrastructure. And the result? They connected hundreds of millions of people far more efficiently.
So, how do we avoid the trap? How do we actually harness the power of Moore's law without becoming its next victim? Well, it takes a shift in mindset, and it requires a much smarter framework for making decisions.
The goal should never be to just invest in technology. Honestly, that statement is meaningless. The real goal is to invest in the right technology that solves a specific problem and helps you meet your goals right now and in the near future. It's all about being fit for purpose.
So here's a practical tool anyone can use. Before you upgrade anything, ask yourself these 4 questions. First, does what you have now actually work fine? Is it really broken? Second, is there something genuinely better out there that will make a real difference? Third, and this is the key one, do the benefits truly outweigh all the costs? And I mean all of them, the money, the training, the disruption. And finally, the toughest one, how long do you really have before change is forced on you? Answering these helps you move from just reacting to actually having a strategy.
But even if you have the perfect framework, there is one final, crucial piece of this puzzle. Because the single biggest mistake we make is thinking this is all about the machines.
I mean, listen to this quote. This is such a powerful statement. The economist Paul Strassman argued that a computer, by itself, is just a box of plastic and silicon. Its actual financial value is basically zero the moment a new one comes out. So, where does the real value come from?
It comes from us, from people. But look at this number. Research suggests that most of us, in most offices, are only using about 10% of our computer's actual capacity. We have these technological chainsaws sitting on our desks, but we're still using them like flint axes. There is a huge gap between the potential of the tech and our ability to actually use it.
And so we arrive at the ultimate takeaway. If you spend $1 million on new software, but you spend $0 on training your people to use it, you've completely wasted your money. It's simple. If the technology advances but the skills of your team don't, entropy wins. The complexity will spiral out of control, and that big, shiny investment is going to fail. Technology and people have to move forward together.
So we've seen the trap, right? We've seen how Moore's law creates this hidden complexity and risk. We've also seen the solution, a framework to invest smartly, not just blindly. And we've uncovered the real key, which isn't the hardware at all, but the people using it. So that brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with. Moore's law pretty much guarantees that the tools in your hands will get exponentially more powerful. The question isn't about the technology anymore. The real question is about you.
So, you've probably heard of the 80-20 rule, right? It's everywhere. But here's the thing. What if I told you that most people, even some really smart managers who swear by it, get it dangerously wrong? Today, we're going to dig into this massive idea and uncover the secret trap that so many people fall into. I mean, have you ever noticed that weird imbalance in your own life? You know, you have a to-do list a mile long, but it feels like just 2 or 3 things on it are going to produce almost all of the results. Or in business, maybe a tiny handful of your clients are bringing in nearly all the cash. Well, it turns out that's not just a feeling. It's a real, fundamental pattern of how the world actually works. So what's behind this? Well, it has a name, the Pareto Principle. You probably know it as the 80-20 rule. Now, here's the key thing to remember. This is not some exact scientific law. It's almost never a perfect 80-20 split. It's better to think of it as a really powerful rule of thumb, a way of seeing that fundamental imbalance we were just talking about. Okay, so where did this whole idea even come from? The origin story is actually pretty fascinating, and it involves a bit of a mix-up, a case of mistaken identity, really, between an economist and an engineer. All right, this is where we clear up a really common misconception. On the left, you've got Vilfredo Pareto. He was an Italian economist, and he's the guy who first noticed the pattern. He saw that, hey, about 80% of the land in Italy was owned by just 20% of the people. But he didn't invent the rule. That credit actually goes to the guy on the right, Joseph Jurin. He was an American engineer, and decades later, he saw the exact same pattern, but in manufacturing defects.
He's the one who actually called it the Pareto principle, naming it in honor of the guy who first spotted the trend. And here's the crazy part. Once you know what you're looking for, you start to see this 80-20 imbalance, well, absolutely everywhere. It's kind of wild. Let's run through a few quick examples from the business world.
Okay, here's a classic example from business. Think about it. For a lot of companies, it's a small group of loyal, high-spending customers, that top 20%, who are actually responsible for a huge chunk, like 80% of the profits.
And it's not just customers. The same thing happens with products. Big retailers look at their numbers and find that, yep, a small handful of their items, again, that top 20%, are the massive bestsellers that are driving 80% of all their sales. And it even applies inside the company. Time and time again, studies and observations show that about 20% of the employees, the real rock stars, the innovators, the super producers, they're the ones creating a whopping 80% of the company's total value. So, when you're a manager and you see data like this, a very logical and, let's be honest, a very tempting question immediately pops into your head, especially if you're trying to be more efficient. And here's the dilemma. If 80% of your customers are only bringing in 20% of your profit, well, should you just fire them? I mean, it seems inefficient to keep them around, right? Why not just pour all of your time, money, and energy into that top 20%? Whoa, not so fast. The risks of doing that are actually huge. I mean, forget the bad publicity for a second. You could be literally cutting off your own future. That small customer today could be your biggest client next year. And this gets to a really important point. It might feel efficient to cut them, but it can be totally destructive to your long-term effectiveness. And this temptation, this urge to just trim away the less productive bits, that leads us straight into the biggest danger of misusing this rule. It's what we're going to call the Pareto trap. Okay, but what about employees? Let's take that same ruthless logic and apply it inside the company. If 20% of your people are creating 80% of the value, why not just, build a super efficient organization with only those top performers? Sounds great on paper, but this is where the logic starts to fall apart.
Let's just play this out. Let's follow this efficiency logic all the way to the end. Okay, so you start with, say, 10,000 employees. You make the cut, keeping only the essential 2,000. But here's the trap. The 80-20 rule just shows up again inside that smaller group. So you do it again, cutting down to 400, then again down to 80. You see what's happening? You're chasing this mirage of perfect efficiency that logically ends with you having no one left at all.
And believe it or not, this isn't just some hypothetical idea. This actually happened. Back in the 1970s, the British automaker Austin Rover fell right into this trap. They were in trouble, so they decided to get efficient by downsizing and focusing only on what they thought were the essential parts of the business. And the result, it was a complete disaster. This quote really says it all. Their attempt to concentrate on essentials actually led them further away from what really mattered. They got so obsessed with being lean and efficient that they forgot that you need a whole functioning organization to actually build and sell cars. They sacrificed effectiveness for the sake of efficiency, and it destroyed them. Okay, so if trying to fix the 80-20 rule is a trap, what are you supposed to do? What's the right way to think about this? Well, the answer is to stop fighting the imbalance. You have to embrace it and start working with it. This is probably the single most important idea to take away from all this. The Pareto principle is like gravity. It's just there. It's a fundamental part of how systems work. You can't beat it. You can't eliminate it. No matter how many times you restructure, that imbalance is just going to pop right back up. So the real goal isn't to fight it. The goal is to accept it and build a strong, healthy system that can thrive with it. Really, this all comes down to two totally different ways of thinking. On one side, you've got the efficiency mindset. That's the one that's always asking, how can we cut the non-essential 80%? But on the other side, you have the effectiveness mindset. This is the one that accepts the principle and asks a much, much better question. What is the total value our entire system creates when all the pieces are working together? Let me put it another way. Think about building a car. Maybe your top 20% of engineers design the amazing engine. That's the vital few. But you absolutely need the other 80% of the team to build the frame, install the seats, paint the car, and put on the wheels. You can't sell a customer a car that's only 80% finished. To deliver any value at all, you need the whole 100%. So, in the end, the 80-20 rule isn't some problem that you need to solve. It's a powerful lens for understanding how the world works. It's a reminder that even though not all parts contribute equally, every part can be absolutely essential to making the whole thing work. So, the real question to ask isn't, how can I get rid of the inefficient 80%? The real strategic question is, what is the true value of my whole organization? And how can I make all the parts, the 20% and the 80%, work together better to create something amazing?
Ever wonder how these giant companies, the ones with hundreds of thousands of employees, actually work? How does one CEO possibly stay in charge of all that? Well, the answer lies in a really fundamental and honestly kind of counterintuitive rule of management. It's something every single growing organization has to figure out: the rule of the span of control.
Okay, so let's break this down with a scenario I think we can all get behind. Picture this. You've started a business. Right now, it's just you, your big idea, and probably a whole lot of coffee. When you're a sole trader, you are the master of your own little universe. Every decision, every single action, it's all under your direct command. You've got 100% control, total command, and it feels great, right? But it just can't last if you actually want to grow.
And here's where things get tricky. This is the classic scaling problem. When you hire your first couple of people, it's still pretty easy to see what they're doing and give them direction. But then, pretty soon, you've got 30 employees, then 50. You don't have eyes in the back of your head. You simply can't be everywhere at once. Direct control becomes physically impossible. Which, of course, brings up a huge question for any company that's getting bigger. If you can't control every single thing yourself anymore, who can? How do you make sure everyone is pulling in the same direction? Well, to answer that exact question, leaders for literally millennia have turned to a concept that eventually got formalized into a rule. So let's take a look at how this classic solution actually works. So what is this span of control? At its heart, it's a pretty simple idea. It basically says that there's a hard limit to how many people any one manager can effectively lead. And it's not just about barking orders. We're talking about influencing, motivating, guiding, checking in. There's just a cap on our mental bandwidths to do all that stuff well. Now, this is not a new idea. Not at all. We can find this concept of delegating authority going back almost 4,000 years to ancient Egypt. But it wasn't until 1933 that this guy, a Lithuanian engineer named V.A. Grakunis, actually put a name and a number to it. And then, decades later, you had leaders like Jack Welch at GE who came along and totally reshaped the idea all over again. So what was that magic number he came up with? Get this. Using a really complex mathematical formula, Grakunis landed on just 4. Yeah, 4. He argued that a manager isn't just managing individuals, they're managing the whole web of relationships between those people. And that complexity, he figured, just maxes out at 4 direct reports. But, a lot of people thought, 4? That seems a little low. As management theory moved forward, the thinking started to shift. Most experts began to feel that a good manager could probably handle a span of about 6 to 8 people, no problem. And today, wow, things have changed. With modern communication tech, Slack, email, all that, and this corporate push for delayering, which is just a fancy way of saying getting rid of middle management, it's not crazy at all to see a manager with 15 or even 20 direct reports. So yeah, that ideal number is definitely a moving target. Okay, so you might be thinking, great, just pick a number and you're set. But not so fast. This is where the simple math runs headfirst into a very, very human problem. This is where we have to confront the paradox of power.
And here's the paradox in a nutshell. For your organization to get bigger, you must hand over some of your control. But in most companies, control is power. So when you delegate control, well, it feels a lot like you're just giving away your own power. And for a lot of leaders, that is an incredibly hard thing to do. And that's exactly why this is so critical. We've all seen it, right? Leaders who try to cling on to power too tightly, they don't just fail to empower their own teams, they literally become the bottleneck holding the entire organization back. And believe me, in big organizations, this whole thing gets 10 times messier. See, large companies often aren't one big happy family. They're more like coalitions of competing groups. Different departments use what are called defensive routines, calling for yet another meeting or demanding more and more data, to block decisions and protect their own turf, even if it hurts the company overall. Delegating in that kind of environment can feel incredibly risky. So,
Okay, direct control has its limits, and just handing over power feels super risky. How on earth do these massive companies actually make it work? Well, the modern answer requires a pretty fundamental shift in thinking, away from the idea of control altogether.
Let's take a look at two corporate giants, General Electric and Tata. Both have around 300,000 employees. GE is a classic hierarchy with formal divisions and reporting structures. Tata, on the other hand, is more like a loose confederation of businesses that are all linked by a shared brand and values. What's really fascinating is that even though their structures are totally different, their leadership style is pretty much the same. It's all about consensus. It has to be. There's no way you can control 300,000 people from an office.
And this leads us to a really powerful, game-changing idea from a political scientist named Mary Parker Follett. She argued that in any complex organization, top-down control isn't just hard, it's an illusion, a complete fantasy. No one person is ever truly in control.
And that one idea, it changes the entire game. The goal isn't to solve the problem of control, it's to get way better at coordination. A modern leader's job isn't to be a micromanager at the top of a pyramid. Their job is to be more like a hub at the center of a network, making sure all the parts can talk to each other and work together smoothly.
So this all boils down to one final question for you to think about. Look at your own workplace, your own team, maybe even your own leadership style. Are the structures and systems in the culture, are they designed to enforce control, or are they designed to foster coordination? The answer to that question might just tell you everything you need to know about its potential to grow.
All right, let's dive into a mystery that I guarantee affects every single one of us. It doesn't matter if you're a student, a CEO, or just, trying to get through your weekly to-do list. Seriously, think about it for a second. Have you ever noticed this? You get 2 weeks for a project, and what happens? It takes 2 weeks. But if you get 2 days for that exact same project, somehow it gets done in 2 days. Why is that? Why do we so rarely finish ahead of schedule? It almost feels like some kind of law of the universe. Well, it turns out there's a name for this. It's called Parkinson's Law, and it comes from this brilliant observation by historian C. Northcote Parkinson back in 1955. And this one sentence just perfectly captures that feeling we all have. But here's the thing. This law is so much more than just a personal time management quirk. It's actually a force that can silently and slowly rot entire organizations from the inside out. So yeah, let's move beyond our own calendars and look at how this one little idea about time snowballs into something way, way bigger. We're talking about the bureaucracy spiral. This is where things get really interesting and kind of dangerous. So here's the more formal definition, but there's a really key insight in here. It's not just that the work takes longer. No, the work itself actually seems to swell in importance, in complexity, just to fill up that time. This is a core principle of how bureaucracies work and, more importantly, how they just keep on growing. And this law doesn't stop at time. Parkinson noticed it expands everywhere. Take resources, for example. You give a department a budget, and you can bet they'll find a way to spend every last penny. Then there's workload. Officials start creating work for each other, just an endless loop of internal tasks. And finally, the hierarchy. People hire more subordinates to manage, because who wants to hire a rival who might challenge them? It's the perfect recipe for just endless, unproductive growth. Parkinson had a great word for this whole process: organizational entropy. Like in physics, where systems just naturally drift toward chaos and disorder. Well, it's the same with organizations. If you leave them unchallenged, they naturally slide into inefficiency and decay. They get bloated, they get slow, and they become totally focused on themselves. And this creates this really stark contrast. A company starts with a clear goal, right? To serve its customers, to create something of value. But under the spell of Parkinson's law, that mission gets completely hijacked. Suddenly, the new goal is just to keep existing. The organization stops working for the outside world and starts working just to serve itself. Now you'd think, okay, this is a clear problem, there's gotta be a clear solution. And back in the early 20th century, a movement came along that seemed like the perfect logical antidote to all of this waste. This was the big promise of scientific management, led by a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor. The idea was actually pretty simple and powerful. Just use data to find the one best way to do every single job. Analyze everything, set strict time standards, and just cut out all the waste. It was supposed to engineer the perfectly efficient organization. Sounds flawless, doesn't it? A system built to fight Parkinson's law at every single turn. So, why didn't it work? Why aren't all of our companies these perfectly efficient machines today? Because it completely forgot about one crucial variable: human nature. The promise was to eliminate waste, but in reality, managers started using these new efficiency numbers as a tool for power. And even worse, to enforce all these new standards, companies had to hire whole armies of analysts and supervisors, creating a brand new layer of bureaucracy. And that's the great irony of the whole thing. The cure actually made the disease worse. The attempt to engineer away inefficiency just created more pointless work for more people to do, which is Parkinson's law playing out all over again. Okay, so if trying to engineer efficiency from the inside doesn't work, what does? Well, the answer isn't inside the organization at all. It's outside. We have to look at the external forces that can actually push back against this natural slide into decay. So really, the battle inside any company is between these two forces. On one side, you have entropy, that natural pull towards decay and self-preservation. That's the default. But on the other side, you have dynamism, a force for growth that's sparked by external challenges, by competition, and by being constantly aware of change. Here's a perfect example. Remember the rental car company Avis? They were stuck at number 2, way behind Hertz. So what did they do? They didn't create a new efficiency department. They just embraced the challenge with a simple, powerful slogan: "We try harder." That underdog mentality created this dynamic, customer-focused culture that was the exact opposite of complacency. And this shows us something really important. Leadership can't just get rid of entropy, but it can foster dynamism. It means you have to embrace competition, you have to encourage new ideas, and you have to create a culture that's always on its toes. Like Intel's Andrew Grove famously said, "Only the paranoid survive." But here's the catch. This battle is never, ever over. Even the most dynamic, incredible companies can fall victim to entropy if they let their guard down. And honestly, there is no better cautionary tale than the story of IBM. See, back in the 1960s, IBM celebrated its innovators. They called them wild geese, people who thought differently, who pushed the boundaries. But then, after decades of dominating the market with no real competition, inertia started to set in. By the 1980s, the bureaucrats were running the show, and the company was just suffocating under its own weight, which led to a near-total collapse in the early 90s. This was a bitter joke they told inside IBM during that time, and it's just a chilling summary of what happens when a culture of dynamism dies and a culture of bureaucracy takes over. The very people who made the company great were either pushed out or just totally silenced. And at the end of the day, this is the most important lesson. You can't solve Parkinson's law. It's not a bug you can fix. It's a fundamental feature of human organizations. It's a force, just like gravity, always pulling things down. You can't eliminate it. You can only actively and constantly fight against it. So I'll leave you with this question to think about. That pull towards comfort, towards doing things the way they've always been done. It's always there. The only thing that can counteract it are the people who are willing to challenge things. So look around your own organization. Who are the wild geese? And are they being celebrated, or are they being shot?
So today, we're going to dive into this really powerful century-old idea that honestly explains how so many organizations actually work. We're talking everything from that new startup in your city all the way up to the government that runs your country. Okay, let's get into it.
You ever had this experience? You join a company or a group, and at the start it's just buzzing with energy and all these great ideas. But then you watch it slowly kind of grind to a halt. It gets rigid, slow, just bogged down by rules. It's this super common frustration, right? That feeling that something dynamic and special has just slipped away. It's a problem so many of us feel, but hardly anyone can put a name to it.
So, you have to ask the big question: why? Why does this happen? Why do these passionate, mission-driven organizations almost always seem to end up in the same place? Is it just a string of bad luck? Is it always just poor leadership?
Well, as it turns out, the answer is no. It's not random. There's a predictable, almost unavoidable principle at work here. Think of it like a force that's as powerful and consistent as a law of physics. It's not bad luck, it's an iron law. And that principle has a name: the iron law of oligarchy.
It's this fascinating theory that explains this whole process, showing how, in pretty much any organization, power just naturally flows upwards, concentrating in a small group at the top.
So what does that mean exactly? Well, an oligarchy is just a fancy word for rule by a few. And the Iron Law says that every organization, I don't care how democratic its goals are at the beginning, is eventually going to be run by a small elite group. It's this natural shift from rule by many to rule by a few.
The guy who came up with this, a political scientist named Roberto Michels, he argued this way back in 1911. And he said, look, this isn't a moral failing. It's just a practical reality. As organizations get bigger, they need structure, they need people with expertise, and they need to make decisions quickly. And all that complexity just naturally leads to a smaller group taking the reins. It's a technical necessity, as he put it.
And you see this everywhere. It's kind of wild how universal it is. You see it in governments, where a small cabinet really holds the power. You see it in corporations with their powerful boardrooms. It even happens in your local country club with its key committees. I mean, the source material even points out that the famous democracy of ancient Athens was, in reality, controlled by a tiny group of oligarchs.
Okay, so if power always concentrates at the top, how does that actually work? What are the tools, or you could call them currencies, that these ruling groups use to build and hold on to their influence?
Well, a management thinker named Charles Handy, he breaks it down into 5 key types. First, there's physical power, the most basic kind. Then there's resource power. That's controlling things people need, like money or technology. Position power. Well, that comes with your job title. Expert power is when you have influence because you just know your stuff. And finally, there's personal power, or charisma, just the sheer force of a compelling personality.
But here, this is the really critical point, okay? None of these forms of power are inherently evil. They're just tools. A hammer can build a house, or it can tear one down. The tool itself is neutral. It all comes down to the intent of the person who's wielding it.
And this slide, wow, it just lays it out perfectly. Take a look at personal power, charisma. It was used by people like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela to inspire these positive, world-changing movements. But that exact same currency of power was used by Adolf Hitler and Enron's Kenneth Lay for totally destructive and corrupt ends. Same tool, completely different outcomes.
So this brings us to what I think is the most important part of this whole conversation. If the Iron Law is inevitable, are we all just doomed to end up with these rigid, self-serving leaders? Well, the answer is no. The law itself might be iron, but the outcome isn't set in stone. There's a huge distinction we need to make here.
So let's break this down. You can think of it as 2 types of rule. On one side, you have the bad oligarchies. These are the ones that hoard power for themselves. They defend the status quo at all costs, and they use force and rigid rules to stay in control. But on the other side, you have good oligarchies. They see their role totally differently. They actively share power, they champion positive change, they stay flexible, and they prefer to lead using persuasion and exchange, not force.
Right, so the whole point here is that a good oligarchy is actively fighting against that natural decay, that entropy. And how do they do it? By sharing power and by staying open to new ideas. The source material points to the leadership at companies like Intel, General Electric, and Tata as examples of groups that really worked hard to keep their organizations dynamic and alive. So what does this all mean for us? Where do we go from here? If we have to have these small ruling groups, how do we make sure they're the good kind? How can we make this Iron Law work for everyone in the organization, not just the few people at the very top?
The whole answer really boils down to this one idea: servant leadership. This is where the leaders don't see themselves as rulers sitting on top of a pyramid. Instead, they see themselves as acting on behalf of everyone else in the organization. They use their power in service of a common goal.
And there's this fantastic little story that it nails this idea perfectly. A Roman senator sees this big crowd rushing by, and he immediately starts running to catch up with them. Someone asks him why, and he says, "There go my people. I must go after them so that I may learn where they want me to lead them." That right there is servant leadership in a nutshell. It's leading by listening and serving.
And that's really the big takeaway here, The Iron Law suggests that trying to get rid of oligarchy completely is probably a lost cause. Instead, our energy is much better spent focusing on how we make our oligarchies more responsive to the needs of the group and more responsible in how they use their power.
So at the end of the day, this leaves us with a final, really powerful question. If some form of oligarchy is going to happen in any group you're a part of, at work, in your community, anywhere, then the real challenge isn't how to avoid it.
The question is how to build a good one. So, where do you start?
Have you ever just looked around your workplace and wondered why so many organizations seem absolutely filled with incompetent managers? Well, there's a powerful and honestly a kind of unsettling theory that explains this exact feeling. It's called the Peter Principle. And in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly why it happens and, more importantly, how to fight it.
I mean, really think about it for a second. You know the one. That brilliant software developer who was an absolute wizard with code, but the second they got promoted to manager, they became a micromanager from hell. Or what about that amazing salesperson who could close any deal, but as a sales director, couldn't lead a team to save their life? This isn't just a string of bad luck, It's a pattern.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll define what the principle actually is. Then, we'll dive into the paradox of why companies keep making this same mistake. After that, we'll look at some pretty disastrous real-world examples. And finally, we'll get to the good stuff, the strategies that can actually break the cycle and build a more competent workplace. Let's get right into it.
This is the core idea, and it comes from a Canadian psychologist named Lawrence J. Peter way back in the 1960s. And it's as blunt as it is devastatingly accurate. In a hierarchy, every person rises to the level of their own incompetence. Let that sink in for a second.
So what this really boils down to is this. We promote people based on what they have done in the past, not on what they can do in the future. We reward someone for being great at one job by giving them a completely different job, and we almost never stop to ask, hey, do they actually have the skills for this new thing? So they just keep rising and rising until, bam, they land in a job they simply cannot do. They've hit their ceiling. It sounds completely crazy, right? Why on earth would any smart organization keep making this fundamental mistake? Well, the answer is what we can call the promotion paradox. And look, on the surface, you can kind of see the logic. Companies, of course, they want to reward their best people. They hope that talent is going to translate to the next level up. Plus, promoting from within, that motivates the whole team, right? It shows hard work pays off. And a big one is retention. In this war for talent, everyone's afraid that if you don't promote your stars, your competitor will steal them away. But this logic, it creates this predictable, almost tragic journey. An employee is amazing at their job, so they get promoted. But the new job, it needs totally different skills. Maybe it's about big picture strategy instead of day-to-day execution. They start facing these new, more complex challenges, and eventually, they just hit a wall. They've reached that one role where they just can't cope effectively anymore. And underneath all of this, there's this powerful force at work, entropy. Just think of it as the natural tendency for things to drift toward chaos as they get more complex. With every single promotion, a manager's job gets more complex, and if their skills don't grow to match that new complexity, chaos starts to creep in.
Okay, so this is not just some abstract management theory. When people get promoted to their level of incompetence in really high-stakes roles, the consequences can be, they can be catastrophic. Let's look at a couple of real-world examples.
Take this story of Redvers Buller, a British Army officer from the 19th century. As a captain, the man was a legend. He was brave, charismatic, a hero who won the nation's highest award for valor. He was the definition of competence. So what happened? He was promoted, and then promoted again, until he was made an army commander. The problem was, the skills were totally different. He couldn't direct a huge operation from the rear. He was obsessed with tiny details, like uniform cleanliness, during a battle. The result? One of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. He was a perfect captain, but an absolutely incompetent general.
And you see the exact same pattern in the business world. Roberto Goizueta was a brilliant chemical engineer and a master of corporate politics who clawed his way up to become president of Coca-Cola. But when he was faced with losing ground to Pepsi, his solution was a complete disaster. He just didn't have that strategic marketing gut, so he did the unthinkable. He ditched the iconic Coca-Cola formula for something called New Coke. The public backlash was immediate and it was massive. He'd been promoted beyond his area of expertise, and it nearly cost the company its crown jewel.
Okay, so the problem is crystal clear, and the stakes are incredibly high. Which brings us to the most important question of all. Is there a way out? Can we actually break this cycle?
What do you think?
And while this whole thing can feel inevitable, the answer is a resounding yes. This is not a law of nature. It's a cycle that can and absolutely must be broken. So how do we do it?
Well, the solutions really start with just being smarter about promotions.
First off, use real assessment systems that test for the skills needed in the new job, not the old one. Second, leaders have got to have the discipline to trust those assessments, even over politics or personal loyalty. Third, don't be afraid to bring in outside candidates. Some new blood can break up those internal cycles. And finally, and this one is huge, focus on continuous development and training. But really, the most effective tool of all comes down to this one simple mindset shift. It's all about continuous development. Once you spot someone with talent, you don't just throw them a promotion. You train them, you educate them, you prepare them for the challenges of that next level. You have to prepare for tomorrow, not just reward for yesterday.
So let's bring this all home. Why is fighting back against the Peter Principle so absolutely critical for any organization that wants to survive, let alone thrive?
Because if you just surrender to it, the consequences are, well, they're grim. You end up with incompetent leaders making terrible decisions, you get unhappy people, both the overpromoted manager who's drowning in stress, and their frustrated team who has to deal with it. And eventually that incompetence and unhappiness, it spreads like a virus, fueling that chaos and dragging the entire organization down.
So that leaves all of us with a final, pretty pointed question to ask about our own workplaces. Are we promoting based on yesterday's success, or are we truly investing in and preparing for tomorrow's challenges? The answer to that, well, it might just determine the future of the entire organization.
You've been there, right? You buy something that just falls apart, or you work with that one person who just sucks all the energy out of their room. Or maybe you're in a meeting, a brilliant idea gets shared, and it gets shot down for the same old, safe, boring plan. It's so frustrating, and it almost feels like there's this unwritten rule that somehow the bad stuff just wins.
Well, it turns out there's actually a name for this. It's called Gresham's Law, and it perfectly explains why the bad so often seems to drive out the good. And to really get it, we need to go back to where it all started.
And what's so wild is that this huge, powerful idea didn't come from psychology or modern business school. Nope, it started more than 500 years ago with something really simple: cold, hard cash.
So, to understand how this law is messing with our lives today, we have to go back to its origin story. And yeah, you guessed it, it is all about money.
So, in its most basic form, Gresham's Law is simply this: bad money drives out good money. It sounds simple, almost too simple. But the logic behind it is actually incredibly smart, and it says a whole lot about how we humans behave.
Okay, so what in the world is good versus bad money? Well, way back when coins were actually made of silver and gold, some rulers would, cheat a little. They'd mill down the coins and mix in cheaper metals like tin or lead. So suddenly you've got two coins that both say $1, but one has way more silver in it. The one with more silver, that's good money. The diluted one, bad money. So what do you think people did? Come on, you know the answer. They held on to the good stuff, the valuable coins, and spent the bad, less valuable coins as fast as they could. And the result? The good money vanished from circulation, and pretty soon only the bad money was left being passed around.
And get this, it wasn't just one guy who noticed this. Sir Thomas Gresham is the one who got his name on the law in the 16th century, but other brilliant minds had already figured it out. We're talking about Nicholas Copernicus, yep, the astronomer, and even a mathematician named Nicol Oresme way back in the 14th century. This is a pattern of human behavior we've been seeing for a long time.
And don't think for a second this is just ancient history. It's happening right now. I mean, if you get a fake coin, you don't turn it in and lose your money, do you? No. You try to spend it somewhere. When Greece switched to the euro, tons of people stashed their old drachma coins, just in case. And in countries where inflation is out of control, people hoard stable money, like US dollars, while spending the local currency that's losing value every day. The law is alive and well.
But here's where things get really interesting. This is the moment when people realized, wait a minute, this isn't just about coins. It's about something much bigger. It's about information.
So, fast forward to the 1970s. An economist named George Akerlof wins a Nobel Prize for studying the used car market. He noticed that crappy cars with hidden problems, he called them lemons, were everywhere. They just kept getting sold over and over. But good, reliable used cars, they were super hard to find. Why? Well, because if you have a good car, you keep it. The bad cars were literally driving the good cars out of the market. Sound familiar?
Akerlof totally nailed the reason why. He called it information asymmetry. It's a fancy-sounding term for a super simple idea. One person in a deal knows a lot more than the other person. The person selling the car knows it's a lemon, but you, the buyer, have no idea. This imbalance of information is the key. It's the modern version of a debased coin. It allows the bad thing to keep circulating while the good thing gets hidden away.
Budget airlines are a perfect and kind of painful modern example. They hook you with this incredibly low fare. That's the bad money. But the airline knows all about the hidden fees for your bag, for picking a seat, for breathing, basically. You, the buyer, don't see the true cost until it's too late. That cheap-looking flight, which is only possible because of that information gap, drives out the more honest, all-inclusive fares.
Okay, now for the fun part. What happens when we start using this idea as a lens to look at our own lives, our jobs, our communities? Well, you start to see the pattern absolutely everywhere.
Think about it in the business world. Once the company gets a reputation for being corrupt, maybe for paying bribes, who's going to want to work with them? The honest companies stay away. The only ones left are, well, other corrupt players. So the company gets pushed deeper and deeper into that world. The bad behavior literally drives out the good.
Or how about meetings? We've all been there. Someone proposes a fantastic, creative, game-changing idea, but it's a little risky. Then one person raises an objection, and you can just feel the energy shift. Fear takes over, and the whole group just defaults to the safe, easy, and usually mediocre idea. That is groupthink, and it's a perfect example of a bad, safe idea driving out a potentially brilliant one.
This one really hurts because it's so true. You get a bully manager or a toxic coworker, and they just make the whole place miserable. So what do the most talented, high-performing people on the team do? They have options. They leave. And who's left behind? The people who feel stuck, or worse, the people who actually thrive in that kind of toxic environment. The bad people cause a massive brain drain, pushing the good people right out the door.
It even works with customers. Picture a hotel that lets a few really loud, obnoxious guests just ruin the experience for everyone else. What happens? The other guests, the ones who just wanted a nice, quiet stay, they leave, and they tell their friends never to go there. The hotel gets a bad reputation, and soon, the only people it attracts are more of those bad customers.
So what happens when a really big organization completely ignores this law? The results can be absolutely catastrophic. Let's look at a real-world warning.
Let's talk about Delta Airlines. A while back, they went all in on efficiency, focusing almost entirely on cutting costs. On paper, it looked great. That was their bad money. But here's the chain reaction it set off. Staff morale just tanked. And when employees are unhappy, customer service goes right out the window. And when service is terrible, what do customers do? They find another airline. The bad idea of efficiency at all costs drove out the good reality of actually being effective.
And the final destination on that flight, Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It's a pretty stark reminder that letting the bad drive out the good isn't just a small problem. It can be a fatal one.
Okay, I know this all sounds kind of bleak, but here is the good news. We are not helpless here. Once you actually understand the law, you can start to fight back against it.
So how do we fight back? You have to go right to the source of the problem. You start by demanding quality, by refusing to let a shoddy product or a lazy idea become the new normal. Then, you have to build a place where good ideas can actually be heard and not just shut down by fear. And that means you have to hire and, more importantly, protect good people. Make them the priority. And finally, you have to work to attract the right kind of customers, the ones who value what you do.
The big takeaway here is this. You can't just sit back and hope for the best. You have to be a guardian of the good. You have to actively, purposefully, and constantly cultivate the good stuff, whether that's good ideas, good products, or good people. Because if you don't, Gresham's law gives us a pretty clear warning about what's going to happen next. The bad will always, eventually, win.
So, as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with a question. Now that you have this new way of seeing things, I want you to look around your own world, at your job and your friendships, even in the stuff you buy. Where do you see Gresham's law playing out? And maybe more importantly, what are you going to do to protect the good?
What if I told you that some of the best rules for surviving a financial meltdown weren't written last year, but 300 years ago? We're about to dig into some seriously timeless wisdom, forged in a crisis that almost broke an entire country, and you'll see why it's maybe more relevant now than ever before. Just look at these two dates, almost 300 years apart, right? But both mark a time when financial markets just went completely off the rails. It's an incredible reminder that when it comes to money, history doesn't just rhyme, sometimes it's pretty much a carbon copy. And that's really the big question we're tackling here. What can we possibly learn from a banker who navigated one of the most insane financial bubbles in history? Well, as you're about to see, the answers are surprisingly simple and, frankly, incredibly powerful.
Okay, let's dive right in. To really get these rules, you first have to understand the absolute chaos that they came from. So let's talk about the South Sea Mania.
So it all kicked off with this one company. The pitch was simple, really. The South Sea Company would take on Britain's huge government debt. In return, it got a monopoly on all trade with South America. Investors were promised, these unimaginable profits, and the hype train just left the station at full speed. And what happened next was just pure madness. Starting around 1719, people started trading shares, and the price just went up, and, well, you get it, everybody wanted in. The share price skyrocketed, and it was fueled by absolutely nothing but the belief that it would just keep rising. Forever. Of course, it didn't.
And you have to understand the human cost here. This wasn't just numbers on a screen. People bet their entire lives on this thing. They mortgaged their homes, their land, anything to get a piece of the action. Even the banks got swept up in it, lending out massive amounts of money with basically no security.
But here's the thing. Underneath all that hype, the whole thing was built on sand. The company was way overextended. There were huge bribes being paid to government officials, and a lot of the copycat businesses that were popping up were just total scams. The collapse wasn't a question of if, it was just a matter of when.
But in the middle of all of this insanity, there was one voice of reason, one guy who looked at the screaming crowds and decided to walk the other way.
His name was Thomas Martin. He was a career banker, a senior partner at the very prestigious Grasshopper Bank. He was right there in the thick of it during the bubble, and not only did he get his bank through it safely, he retired a rich man in his 40s and lived to be 96. Clearly, this guy knew what he was doing.
Now what's interesting is, at first, even Martin dipped a toe in and bought some shares. But by 1719, he saw the writing on the wall. He didn't just quietly sell his own shares. He completely changed his tune and started actively wanting his clients to stay away from all of it.
I mean, can you imagine how unpopular that must have made him? Everybody else is getting rich, on paper at least, and Martin is the guy in the corner shouting, "Stop!" As you can probably guess, not a lot of people were interested in hearing his cautious advice.
And you know who that sounds a lot like? Warren Buffett. Martin's refusal to get swept away by the crowd is exactly what Buffett did centuries later during the dot-com bubble in the 90s. Both of them chose common sense over the popular opinion, and both were proven right in a big way. So, after the bubble burst and wiped out countless fortunes, Martin sat down in the middle of all that wreckage and decided to write down what he'd learned. He created a guide to make sure his bank would never, ever make those same mistakes again.
He called it Proper Considerations for Persons Concerned in the Banking Business. So, it wasn't some bestseller, It was basically an internal handbook for his staff, a set of rules to protect them from this kind of speculative foolishness forever.
So what were these rules? Well, rule number 1 is just pure common sense, but it's also the first thing that gets forgotten in a bubble. Martin wrote that a banker needs judgment on what sum is proper to be lent, or in today's terms, know your limits. Don't get overextended.
Okay, the second rule gets a little more specific. First, only lend money against real collateral, something you can actually get your hands on if the loan goes bad. And second, and this is just brilliant, only lend if there's a good chance of repayment and it won't totally crush the borrower. His logic was so simple. A desperate borrower is a risky one. It's about creating a safe, sustainable loan for everyone involved.
Now, this one might be Martin's most counterintuitive rule. He basically said that appearing cautious, even a little bit fearful, actually builds a good reputation. It's not just about being careful, it's about making caution your brand. Why? Because that attracts other sensible, cautious customers, the best kind you can have.
And here we go again with another echo of Warren Buffett. A core principle for Martin was to avoid businesses that were unprofitable and overly complex. If you can't easily see how it makes money safely, just stay away. It's pretty much the 18th century version of never invest in a business you can't understand.
So, how does all this 300-year-old advice hold up in our world of crypto, meme stocks, and non-stop hype? Well, let's bring it all home.
The difference is pretty stark, isn't it? Martin believed that being unwilling to take huge risks was a strength, something that builds trust.
Today, having a little appetite for risk is often seen as a weakness, like you're not aggressive enough to really make it.
And this quote just sums it all up perfectly. During those times of irrational exuberance, as economists call it, when everyone seems to be getting rich quick, basic common sense is the first thing to go out the window. And that's exactly when Martin's rules become the most important.
So, when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway? The lessons are truly timeless. Know your limits. Insist on real security. Treat being careful as a virtue, not a weakness. Stay away from what you don't understand. And above all else, hold on to your common sense when it feels like everyone else has lost theirs.
Which brings us to the end. Martin wrote down his rules to protect his business and his clients. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? In our modern world, with all the hype and the fear of missing out, what are the rules that you live by?
If you're a manager, or if you've ever had one, you know the feeling. Management can feel like a constant battle, right? And what's wild is that over 100 years after the first theories were written, we're still wrestling with the exact same core question. And this is it, right here. Is management some kind of orderly science that you can learn, a series of predictable steps? Or is it just chaos, a constant scramble of putting out fires and making calls on pure instinct?
So on one side, you've got thinkers like Henry Mintzberg. They'd argue that what managers actually do is messy, it's reactive, it's that tangled web you see on the left. But on the other side, you have this ideal of order, a belief that management could be a structured, disciplined thing, just like a set of well-oiled gears. And the pioneer of the ideal? A man named Henri Fayol. So who was this guy who tried to bring order to all that chaos? Well, you might be picturing some stuffy academic in an ivory tower, but Fayol was the complete opposite. He was a man of action, a leader who came up with his theories right there in the trenches of a real-life business turnaround.
He actually started out as a mining engineer. And yeah, he was good at it, but his real genius wasn't in engineering rocks. It was in engineering organizations. He even said it himself. He became a far better manager than he ever was an engineer.
I mean, just look at this incredible journey. In 1888, he takes the helm of a company that is on the brink of total collapse. Over the next 30-plus years, he doesn't just save it. He turns it into an absolute industrial powerhouse. And this is so important. His 14 principles weren't dreamed up in a classroom. They were forged in the fire of this massive turnaround. All right, so let's get into his principles, starting with the foundation, structure. Fayol was convinced that if you wanted to build a great organization, you had to start with a solid, easy-to-understand structure. Because without that, everything else would eventually just fall apart. At the very heart of his ideas on structure is something he called the scalar hierarchy. Now, I know it sounds a little old-fashioned, but the idea is timeless. It's just a clear chain of command where everybody, and I mean everybody, knows exactly where they fit, what they're supposed to be doing, and who they report to. It's all about clarity. And here's the thing. Modern research totally backs him up. He knew it intuitively, but we have the data. When people have that kind of clarity, they go from confused to committed. Their performance, their drive, it just skyrockets. Because vagueness, it's a total motivation killer. But what happens when that clarity gets broken? Come on, we've all been there. Your project manager tells you to focus on task A, but your department head comes by and says, no, task B is the #1 priority. And what's the result? Total paralysis, frustration. Nothing gets done. Fayol's solution to this was so simple and elegant. Unified command. One employee, one boss, period. The goal is to completely wipe out any confusion by creating a single, clear line for communication and instructions. And he rounded out his ideas on structure with a few other key principles. Things like division of labor, basically, let specialists do their thing. Unity of direction, making sure everyone is pulling in the same direction toward the same goal. And centralization, the idea that ultimately the buck has to stop somewhere. But Fayol was smart. He knew that a great structure is pretty useless without the right people working inside it. So his next set of principles is all about the human element. How do you actually build and keep a motivated, effective team? Okay, so the word discipline can sound a little harsh to our ears today, right? But Fayol didn't mean punishment. He meant something much closer to professional rigor.
It's not about cracking the whip, it's about creating shared habits and a focused mindset so everyone can do their absolute best work. He also talked about subordinating individual interests. And again, this isn't about crushing people's individuality. It's a simple reminder of why everyone is even there, for the team's collective success. Because the moment people or departments start working against each other, the whole thing starts to wobble. And the list of common sense ideas goes on, and they're all just as relevant today. Fair pay, treating people with equity, providing job stability so you're not constantly losing your best minds, encouraging people to take initiative, and of course building that all-important team spirit, what he called esprit de corps. It's all there. So you look at all this, and 100 years later, it sounds pretty good. But let's be real. The modern workplace is a different beast. Can these century-old ideas from a French mining company really work for today's tech startups or global corporations? Let's just tackle the obvious objections head on. Take centralization. We live in an age that celebrates flat organizations and empowered teams, so doesn't the idea of a central authority just feel completely outdated? Well, here's the modern take. The center doesn't have to be a person, a CEO sitting in a corner office. That central authority can be the moral authority of a really powerful mission or a crystal clear set of company values that guides everyone's decisions. The principle of a guiding force is still there, even if its form has changed.
Okay, what about unified command? In so many companies today, you have matrix organizations where it's totally normal to report to a department head and a project lead. Fails one boss rule seems completely broken here, doesn't it? Well, not if you look at the spirit of the law instead of the letter. The real point of unified command was always clarity of purpose. It means that even if you have two bosses, they have to be in sync. They can't be giving you conflicting directions. The goal isn't a rigid org chart, it's making sure the employee is never, ever caught in the middle. And when you boil it all down, all 14 of Fayol's principles really point to this one powerful idea. He was one of the very first to say that management has to be driven by purpose. Without that, all the planning, all the organizing, it's just empty actions. It's just going through the motions.
And so that really leaves us with one final thought. It doesn't matter if you lead a team of 2 people or 2,000. This is the most important question you can ask yourself. What is the clear, unifying purpose that gives meaning to everything you and your team do?
Today, we're going to talk about a guy who completely flipped modern management on its head. His name was W. Edwards Deming, and his philosophy on quality didn't just tweak how businesses worked, it totally revolutionized them. Seriously, his work challenged the very core of how we think about productivity, profit, and most importantly, people.
It seems almost obvious now, right? But for decades, the standard thinking was that making things better just cost more money. Deming looked at that and asked a totally radical question. What if focusing on quality actually saved money? What if it eliminated waste and made customers so happy they kept coming back? It's a counterintuitive idea that sparked a whole new way of thinking about business.
So to really get a handle on Deming's impact, we need to go back and see where these ideas came from. This wasn't some sudden light bulb moment. It was the result of decades of scientific thought that started in a pretty unexpected place. I love this intellectual journey. It actually starts with Charles Darwin and his work on variation in nature. Then, a guy named Ronald Fisher comes along and figures out the statistical tools to measure all that variation. And then, here's the big leap. Walter Shewhart at Western Electric has this brilliant idea. What if we use those same tools, not for biology, but for factory assembly lines, to measure the tiny little differences in the thickness of a telephone wire? That idea became statistical quality control. And guess who was right there learning from the master? W. Edwards Deming. And this is where the story gets really wild. After World War II, Deming took his ideas to Japan. See, American companies, they were obsessed with just churning out stuff, mass production. But Japan, which had been devastated by the war, was looking for a better way to rebuild. Their culture of working together was the perfect place for Deming's ideas to take root. Companies like Toyota went all in on his philosophy. And the result? Japan became a global manufacturing giant. Kinda ironic that an American prophet had such a huge hand in making that happen. This quote, it just says it all. For Deming, management wasn't about gut feelings or just doing what the boss says. It was a science. You had to have proof. You had to have hard data that showed you what was really going on inside your system. No more guessing. You know, this whole data-driven approach led to a massive shift in how we even think about quality. It was a move away from the old way of doing things, which was just catching your mistakes at the end,
to a much smarter, proactive model, stopping the mistakes from ever happening at all. Think about it. The old way was all about inspection. You'd make 1,000 of something, check them all at the end of the line, and just throw out the 100 that were busted. All that waste was just baked into the cost of doing business. But Deming said that's crazy. Let's prevent the defects in the first place. Let's design the system so well that we reduce or even get rid of the mistakes entirely. This is where that famous phrase, quality is free, comes from. The money you invest in a better system pays for itself over and over again. It's brilliant. So Deming laid out this whole blueprint for changing a company's culture in his famous 14 points. Now, instead of just reading you a long list, we're going to group them into 3 big core principles that really get to the heart of what he was talking about. The first principle is so simple, but it's incredibly profound. Fix the system. Deming believed that most problems, maybe 90% of them, aren't caused by bad workers. They're caused by a bad system. So a manager's job isn't to go around blaming people. It's to constantly improve the process. That means having a clear mission, focusing on long-term value instead of just the cheapest price tag, and building quality in from the very start. But hey, a great system doesn't mean anything if you don't have great people. And that brings us to principle number 2, unleash your people. Deming pushed for real leadership, the kind that inspires people, not just management that tells them what to do. He famously said we have to drive out fear because people do their best, most creative work when they feel safe and respected. That means training people constantly, getting rid of all the annoying stuff that stops them from being proud of what they do, and just creating a place where people actually want to learn and grow. And the third principle is what ties it all together. You have to transform the entire culture. You can't have a great system or amazing people if the culture is toxic. Deming said we have to break down those walls between departments, the silos, so people can actually work together. He was also completely against empty slogans on the wall and random quotas, which he saw as just tools to create fear. The whole point is to get everybody, from the brand new hire to the CEO, pulling in the same direction. This whole philosophy brings up a really interesting tension that's kind of at the very heart of management theory. It's this paradox about who an organization is really for. Is it for the group, or is it for the individual? So if you look at an earlier management guru, Omri Fail, he was all about the organization coming first. The individual had to kind of bend to the needs of the group for everything to work. But Deming, he came along and just flipped that script. He argued that the whole point of an organization is to serve the individual, to give people a platform to do meaningful work and create value. So who's right? Well, the answer, of course, isn't that simple. It's not one or the other. The real test of a great manager is finding that delicate balance between the two. It's like a yin-yang. You need enough control so the company has focus, but you need enough freedom so people can be creative and solve problems. You need reliable processes, but you also need individual genius to have those breakthrough moments. The truth is, organizations and individuals need each other to really succeed. So, why are we still talking about these ideas so many decades later? Well, it's because Deming's work was never just about statistics or factories. It was about something much deeper, something more human, about how people and systems work best when they work together. When you boil it all down, Deming's true, lasting legacy is a fundamental shift in what management even is. He taught us to move away from this rigid, paint-by-numbers style of just using checklists and hitting quotas. Instead, he showed us that real leadership is built on a shared purpose, a desire to always be learning, and a deep respect for the people who actually do the work. And that leaves us with one final, really important question to think about. Think about your own job, your own team. Is it driven by fear and micromanagement, or is it guided by a shared mission where everyone feels empowered to make things better? Put simply, does your organization run on checklists, or does it run on purpose? The answer to that question might just tell you everything you need to know.
Today, we're going to dive into one of the biggest questions in business. And the answer, well, it's a single, simple rule. But trust me, this one rule might just change how you look at everything from your local coffee shop to the biggest companies in the world.
So, let's start right there. What is the real fundamental purpose of a business? Seriously, before we go any further, just take a second. What's your gut answer? What's the very first thing that pops into your head?
If you're like most of us, your answer was probably something like this: to make money, right? Turn a profit. Or to create value for the people who own the stock. Maybe to create jobs for the community. And look, these are the answers we hear all the time. They seem so obvious. But what if they're not the real answer? What if they're just the side effects of something way more important?
Well, here's a totally different answer from one of the greatest business thinkers ever, Peter Drucker. He said that profit, shareholder value, jobs, all of that stuff, they're just results. They happen when you succeed at the one true purpose, to create a customer. It's such a simple sentence, but wow, the idea behind it is absolutely radical.
Okay, so let's really dig into this radical rule, because to get why that simple phrase is so powerful, you first have to understand the guy who said it, and more importantly, what he lived through.
See, Peter Drucker wasn't just some academic sitting in an ivory tower. He was born in Austria, worked as a journalist in Germany, and actually had to flee for his life after an article he wrote really ticked off the Nazi Party. He saw firsthand how entire societies could either thrive or completely fall apart. And that experience forged his belief that business, when it's done right, is an incredible force for good and a pillar of human freedom.
All right, now let's zero in on his very specific choice of words. He didn't say the purpose is to find a customer or to get a customer. He said the purpose is to create one. That one little word, it changes everything. So what on earth did he mean by that?
For Drucker, this was an active thing, not passive. It's not enough to just, open up shop and hope people wander in. A business has to actively go out there, find people with needs they might not even know they have, and then show them, genuinely show them how what you offer can make their lives better. It's about demonstrating value so clearly that a customer is, in effect, brought into existence. But here's the kicker. While Drucker gave this idea its most famous catchphrase, he wasn't the first person to think of it. Not by a long shot. In fact, this idea, that a business is really here to serve society, is like a golden thread that you can trace back through thousands of years of human history. And what's so fascinating when you look at a timeline like this is that Drucker didn't just pull this idea out of thin air. He was really standing on the shoulders of giants. He's part of a long line of thinkers, from ancient philosophers to modern industrialists, who all, somehow, arrived at the same basic insight. Business, at its core, is about serving a need.
I mean, let's go all the way back to ancient Greece. Even Plato, in his famous work, The Republic, argued that society works because we trade with each other. You've got something I need, I've got something you need. This back and forth, this act of serving one another. Plato said it wasn't just some side activity of civilization. It was one of the essential things that makes civilization possible in the first place.
And what's so cool is you see the exact same idea popping up in completely different cultures. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. The Christian scholar Thomas Aquinas said that merchants actually add to the sum total of happiness because they provide things people need. And around the same time, the brilliant Muslim thinker Ibn Khaldun made almost the exact same point. He said trade helps everybody, and that profit is just the fair reward a merchant gets for taking a risk to help the community. Now let's jump to the 20th century, and you can see this philosophy in action. A Japanese industrialist named Konosuke Matsushita, the founder of Panasonic, had this crystal-clear mission after World War II: make consumer goods plentiful and affordable. He truly believed that this was the way to pull people out of poverty and create a happier society. For him, the purpose was service. The profit? That was just the scorecard that proved he was doing a good job.
So we've got this incredible idea that stretches back for ages. But how does any of this apply to our crazy modern world of social media ads and global supply chains? Well, the answer lies in totally rethinking what marketing is actually for.
So one of the biggest challenges in any market is this thing called information asymmetry. Now that sounds like a super fancy term, but it's a really simple idea. A lot of the time, the seller knows way more about a product and all the different options than the buyer does. And that knowledge gap, well, it can lead to bad decisions for us as consumers.
So if you look at it through this lens, the real honorable purpose of marketing isn't to trick people or manipulate them into buying stuff they don't need. It's to close that information gap. It's about educating people, showing them the solutions that exist for their problems, and empowering them to make better choices. And when you do that, you create a customer.
And maybe the best modern example of this is the whole bottom of the pyramid idea. The late business guru C.K. Prahalad argued that the world's poorest people are actually a massive overlooked market. He said that the companies that figure out how to serve them and do it profitably, they aren't just doing charity. They are performing the most essential act of business, creating customers by genuinely making their lives better.
Okay, but now we have to talk about the elephant in the room. This is a totally fair question. In a world that's dealing with climate change and limited resources, doesn't this whole mission to create customers just mean we're encouraging more and more buying and pushing our planet over the edge? And that is the great paradox of our time. But Drucker's rule actually shows us a way through it.
Marketing can absolutely be part of the problem, but, and this is a big but, it can also be a huge part of the solution. By closing the information gap on sustainable choices, by telling people about energy-saving gadgets or ethically made clothes, marketing can shift our demand, not just mindlessly increase it. It can create customers for a better, more sustainable world.
So this brings everything we've talked about down to one single point. It reveals the ultimate choice that every single business and really every person working inside a business has to make.
It really just boils down to this. You can choose to focus on your real purpose, serving society by creating customers. That path creates this amazing cycle where the company and the customer both win. Or you can turn inward and just focus on yourself and your own profits. But that path, as Drucker would warn us, leads to forgetting the very people you exist to serve. And eventually, that leads to decay.
And that brings us right back to the beginning. From Plato's Greece all the way to Drucker's America, the big takeaway is the same. Businesses were invented as a tool to help society. They exist for us. We don't exist for them. The profit is just the fuel that keeps the engine running. It's not the destination. It's the applause you get for serving your customers well.
So the question Drucker really leaves us with is this. A business is defined not by its profits, but by the customer it creates. So, who will you choose to create?